The knife was at her throat before Alira even saw the man move. She had been carrying a basket of bread across the dark courtyard, her mind on nothing more than the ache in her feet, when a hand closed over her mouth and pulled her back into the shadow of the stone wall. The basket fell. Bread rolled across the cobblestones. A blade pressed flat and cold against her skin, and a voice she did not know whispered into her ear that if she screamed, she would not live to regret it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She could not move, could not breathe, could only feel the stranger's grip tighten as he dragged her deeper into the shadows, away from the torchlight, away from anyone who might glance out a window and see. Somewhere above her, an owl called out once and went silent, as if even the night knew to look away. Alira had lived in the Ashgrove Pack estate since she was 12 years old, and in all that time, she had never once been foolish enough to walk the west courtyard after dark. Everyone knew that the western wall bordered packland that had not always been friendly. Everyone knew that scouts and spies sometimes tested the edges of Ashgrove territory at night, searching for a crack in the defenses. She had simply forgotten, tonight, because her mind had been elsewhere, because she had been sent to deliver bread for the kitchen staff at the worst possible hour, and now a stranger's blade was resting against her neck, and she was certain she was about to die in a courtyard nobody would think to search until morning. Then a low growl rolled through the dark, deep enough that she felt it in her chest before she heard it in her ears. The man behind her went rigid. His blade did not move, but his breathing changed, quick and shallow, the breathing of someone who has just realized he has made a terrible mistake. Alira's eyes darted toward the sound, toward the far end of the courtyard where the shadows seemed to gather and thicken into something with a shape and a purpose. A wolf stepped into the moonlight. Not an ordinary wolf. This one stood taller than any wolf had a right to stand, its fur so dark it looked like a piece of the night had peeled itself off the sky and given itself teeth. Its eyes burned gold, and when it looked at Alira, something in its gaze made her forget, for one strange heartbeat, that there was a knife pressed to her throat at all. She had heard the stories, the way everyone in the pack had. The Alpha King's wolf was said to be the largest seen in 3 generations, a beast born of an old and powerful bloodline, capable of tearing through steel as easily as parchment. She had never seen him shift, not once in all her years serving the estate. Servants did not attend the private training grounds where the Alpha practiced with his warriors. Servants did not walk the halls where the king discussed matters of pack security. Servants existed at the edges of his world, unseen, unimportant, and that suited her fine, because unseen people rarely became targets. Tonight, it seemed, the wolf had decided that she mattered very much. The man holding her cursed under his breath, low and frightened, and began to back away, dragging Alira with him, using her as a wall between himself and the golden-eyed beast advancing across the courtyard. The wolf did not rush forward. It moved slowly, deliberately, each paw falling without a sound, as if it wanted the man to understand precisely how much danger he was in, and precisely how little chance he had of escaping it. "Stay back," the man snarled, his blade pressing harder into Alira's skin, hard enough that she felt a thin line of pain bloom across her throat. "One more step and I open her neck." The wolf stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. The torches along the courtyard wall flickered in a breeze that smelled faintly of rain. Alira's pulse pounded so loudly in her ears that she almost missed the sound of a second growl, quieter than the first, coming from somewhere behind the intruder. She realized, with a jolt of understanding, that more wolves had arrived, circling wide through the shadows, cutting off every path of retreat. The man realized it too. His breathing turned ragged. "There is no version of tonight where you walk out of this courtyard," a voice said. It was not the wolf's voice, not exactly, but it carried the same weight, the same low authority, as though the animal and the man speaking were one and the same creature wearing 2 different shapes. Alira turned her head as far as the blade allowed and saw him standing at the courtyard's edge, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark clothing that did nothing to hide the danger radiating off him. His eyes had not lost their gold shimmer, even though he now stood on 2 feet instead of 4. Alpha King Damian Ashgrove. She had seen him from a distance perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always across a courtyard or through a doorway, always surrounded by advisors and guards and the general hum of importance that followed him everywhere. She had certainly never expected to see him standing before her at midnight while a stranger held a blade to her throat, and she had definitely never expected the way his gaze fixed on her, not on the intruder, not on the knife, but on her face, as if memorizing every detail of it in case this was the last chance he ever got. "Let her go," Damien said, "and I promise your death will be quick." "And if I don't?" the man asked, though his voice cracked on the question. "Then it will not be." The intruder's arm trembled. Alira could feel it through the blade, through the hand still clamped over her mouth. She understood, in that moment, that he was calculating his odds and finding all of them terrible. Whatever pack had sent him here, whatever mission he had been given, none of it had accounted for the Alpha King himself appearing in the courtyard, wolf and warriors both, faster than any scout should have been able to summon them. "She's just a servant," the man said, his voice pitching higher, pleading now instead of threatening. "Why does the Alpha King care what happens to a kitchen girl?" Something shifted in Damien's expression, something Alira couldn't name, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You ask the wrong question," he said. "The right question is why you thought you could cross into my territory and put your hands on anyone standing inside it." The man's grip loosened, just slightly, just enough. It was all the opening the shadows needed. Two shapes broke from the darkness on either side, warriors of the Ashgrove pack who had circled unseen, while their king held the intruder's attention, and within a single heartbeat, the blade was wrenched away from Alira's throat, and she was pulled free, stumbling forward into open air, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. She did not see what happened to the intruder. She heard it, a short cry cut off almost as soon as it began, and she made herself look straight ahead instead of behind her, because some part of her understood that whatever justice had just been carried out in that courtyard was not meant for her eyes. A hand caught her elbow before she could fall. She looked up, startled, and found the Alpha King himself steadying her, his fingers warm and careful against her skin, despite the violence that had just unfolded a few feet away. Up close, he was larger than she had realized, and there was something in his eyes, something searching and intense, that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so at the same time. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Her hand rose to her throat without her permission, fingers brushing the thin cut left by the blade. It stung, but it was shallow, nothing that wouldn't heal in a day or two. "I'm fine," she managed. "Thank you, my lord. I don't know how you knew, how you found me." "My wolf knew," he said, and something about the way he said it made her feel as though the words meant more than they seemed to. "He has been restless tonight. I didn't understand why until now." Alira had no idea what to say to that, so she said nothing, standing there in the moonlight, with her heart still racing, acutely aware of how close he stood, how his gaze had not once left her face since she'd risen from the ground. Around them, the warriors were already dealing with the aftermath, low voices exchanging quick reports, someone gathering the fallen basket of bread as though it mattered, as though anything about tonight had been ordinary. "You should not have been out here alone," Damien said finally, releasing her elbow, as if he had only just realized he was still holding it. "I was sent to deliver bread to the East Kitchen," she said. "I didn't think. I've walked this courtyard 100 times. Not at this hour. Not with what we've been tracking near the border." He studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "What is your name?" "Alira," she said. "Alira Vance." He repeated it quietly, almost to himself, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "Alira," he said again, and the way her name sounded when he spoke it sent an unfamiliar warmth through her chest, one she immediately told herself to ignore. He was the Alpha King. She was a servant who had nearly gotten her throat cut over a basket of bread. Whatever strange current passed between them in that courtyard meant nothing, could mean nothing, and the sooner she remembered that, the better. "Thank you for saving me," she said, taking a careful step back, putting distance between them that her body did not entirely want to allow. "I should return to the kitchens. They'll be wondering where I am." "I'll have someone walk you," Damien said, and it was not a suggestion. "That isn't necessary, my lord." "It is," he said, and though his voice remained calm, there was an edge beneath it that told her this was not a point open for discussion. He turned his head slightly, and one of the warriors who had helped free her stepped forward immediately, a young man with sharp eyes and a scar along his jaw. Finn will see you safely inside. Have the healer look at that cut. It's only a scratch. Humor me, he said, and for just a moment, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face into something younger, something less like a king and more like a man. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the composed authority she imagined he wore, like armor most hours of the day. Go, Alira. You've had enough excitement for one night. She nodded, murmured her thanks again, and let Finn guide her back across the courtyard, toward the warm lights of the kitchen entrance. She did not look back, though every instinct in her body wanted to see whether the Alpha King was still watching her go. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that tomorrow, this strange midnight encounter would feel like a dream, something to tuck away and forget, a story she would never tell anyone, because no one would believe a servant girl had been rescued by the Alpha King himself, and had felt, for one impossible moment, as though his gaze held something far warmer than simple concern for a stranger's safety. She was wrong. Behind her, Damien stood alone in the courtyard, long after Finn and Alira had disappeared through the kitchen door, his wolf pacing beneath his skin, refusing to settle, refusing to let go of the scent that still lingered in the night air. He had felt many things in his years as Alpha King. He had felt the crushing weight of responsibility the day his father died, and left him a crown before he was ready for it. He had felt the cold calculation required to negotiate treaties with Pax, who smiled at him and plotted against him in the same breath. He had felt fury, and grief, and the bone-deep exhaustion of leading people who depended on him for their survival. He had never felt anything like what surged through him the moment he caught her scent on the night wind, and understood, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that a servant girl he had barely noticed in 3 years of living in the same estate was standing in danger, and that if anything happened to her, some vital part of himself would break beyond repair. His wolf had known her before he did. That was the truth of it, the truth he could not explain to his warriors, could not explain to the elders who would be furious to learn of it, could not fully explain to himself. His wolf had gone from calm to frantic within seconds of sensing her fear, had dragged him from his private study and through the halls faster than he had moved in years, faster than duty or reason or the careful control he prided himself on could restrain. He thought of the elders' meeting from earlier that week, the list of noble names laid out before him like a menu of acceptable futures. He thought of how his wolf had remained utterly silent through every single one of those names, indifferent, almost bored, as though none of them mattered at all. And then he thought of the way his wolf had roared to life the instant Alira Vance's name entered his awareness, and he understood, standing alone in the moonlit courtyard with the scent of her fear and her courage still hanging in the air, that his life had just changed in ways the elders were not going to like. He did not yet know how right he was. The healer's room smelled of dried herbs and warm candle wax. Alira sat on the edge of a narrow cot, while an older woman named Greta dabbed a stinging paste along the thin cut on her throat, muttering under her breath about foolish girls wandering the western courtyard after dark. Alira barely heard her. Her mind kept replaying the moment the wolf's golden eyes had found her across the shadows, the way fear had drained out of her body the instant she realized help had come. "You're shaking," Greta said, not unkindly, wrapping a light bandage around the wound. "I'm fine," Alira said, though her hands betrayed her, trembling in her lap. "You were nearly killed tonight, girl." Shaking is the sane response. Greta tied off the bandage and studied her with sharp, knowing eyes. "I heard it was the Alpha himself who found you, in wolf form no less. That's not a small thing." "He happened to be nearby," Alira said quickly. "His warriors were patrolling the border." Greta made a small sound in her throat, the kind of sound old women make when they hear a story they don't quite believe, but have decided not to argue about. "If you say so." She packed away her supplies and rose. "Rest tonight. No more deliveries until that cut closes. I'll speak to the kitchen mistress myself." When Greta left, Alira remained sitting on the cot for a long while, staring at the flickering candle on the small table beside her, trying to make sense of the tangled feelings still churning in her chest. She told herself it was only shock, only the natural aftermath of nearly dying, that made her keep thinking of the Alpha King's face, the intensity in his gaze, the strange gentleness in his hands when he'd steadied her. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. Word of the attack spread through the servants' quarters before morning arrived. By the time Alira woke, pale sunlight slipping through the narrow window of the room she shared with two other kitchen girls, everyone already seemed to know some version of the story, each retelling more dramatic than the last. One girl swore the intruder had been a trained assassin sent by a rival pack to strike at the Alpha King himself. Another claimed Alira had fought the man off with nothing but her bare hands before the king arrived. Alira corrected no one. It was easier to let the rumors grow strange and distorted than to admit the truth, that she had been helpless, frozen, saved only because a wolf, far more powerful than any ordinary guard, had sensed her fear from across the estate. She kept that detail to herself. Somehow, admitting it made the whole night feel more significant than she was ready to face. Across the estate, in a chamber far removed from the servants' quarters, the pack elders convened in a hurried, unhappy meeting. News of a border incursion always brought tension, but this particular incident had stirred something else entirely, a thread of unease that ran beneath the elders' formal discussion of border security and rival pack movement. "The Alpha shifted and moved before any warning bell was even rung," said Elder Corwin, a stern man with silver hair and a voice that carried the weight of 40 years, advising the Ashgrove throne. No scout reported the intrusion, no sentry raised an alarm, and yet our king arrived in the western courtyard within moments, already in wolf form, already prepared to fight. "Perhaps his senses are simply sharper than we credit," offered a younger elder, though even he did not sound convinced. "Sharper senses do not explain why he abandoned a private council meeting the instant a servant girl left the kitchens," Corwin said. "I have served 3 Alphas in my lifetime. I know instinct when I see it. What moved our king last night was not duty." The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone present understood what Corwin was implying, even if none of them wished to say the word aloud. Mate bonds were not chosen. They were not negotiated, not arranged through careful diplomacy or advantageous alliances. They simply happened, ancient and absolute. And if the Alpha King's wolf had truly recognized a servant girl as his fated match, then every careful plan the elders had built around his marriage, every alliance they hoped to secure through a proper Luna, stood in sudden and serious danger. "We cannot know that for certain," said Elder Marisol, the only woman among the elders, her tone measured but troubled. "A king's instincts to protect his people are not proof of a bond." "No," Corwin agreed. "But they are reason enough for concern. I suggest we watch this matter closely, very closely." Later that morning, Damien sat alone in his study, staring at a report he had read 3 times, without absorbing a single word of it. His wolf had not settled since the previous night, pacing restlessly beneath his skin, agitated by nothing he could name, except the fact that Alira was somewhere in the estate, out of his sight, out of his reach. He knew what it meant. He had known the moment he stood in that courtyard and felt his entire body shift its priorities around one servant girl's safety without his permission. He had spent the hours since trying to convince himself it was a mistake, a fluke, some strange side effect of the danger and adrenaline of the encounter. He did not believe himself. His wolf certainly did not believe him either. A knock interrupted his thoughts, and his personal guard entered, informing him that the elders had requested an audience before midday. Damien set down the report, exhaled slowly, and rose from his desk, already bracing himself for a conversation he suspected he was not going to enjoy. Whatever the elders wanted to discuss, he had a strong feeling it would not be about border security at all. The council chamber was colder than usual when Damien entered, or perhaps it only felt that way because of the 5 pairs of eyes that turned toward him the moment he stepped through the heavy doors. Elder Corwin stood at the head of the long table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in the way that always meant trouble. "You wish to speak with me," Damien said, taking his seat at the head of the table without waiting for an invitation. "We heard of last night's incident," Corwin began. "An intruder within our borders, dealt with swiftly. Efficient work, as always." "Then this meeting is simply to congratulate me?" Damien asked, though he already knew better. Corwin's mouth tightened. "We also heard how quickly you responded, before any alarm was sounded, before any warrior reported movement near the western wall." Damien kept his expression even, though beneath the table, his hand curled into a fist. My senses are attuned to danger within my own territory. That is not new information, Corwin. Attuned to danger, yes, Marisol said gently, though there was steel beneath her words. But attuned specifically to one servant girl's location, that is new information, my king, and it concerns us. The room went very still. Damien let the silence stretch, weighing his options, weighing how much he was willing to admit in a room full of elders who had already made their suspicions plain. He thought of Alira's face in the moonlight, the fear in her eyes, giving way to something steadier the moment she looked at him. He thought of his wolf, calm now only because it knew, somewhere in the estate, she was safe. You called me here to discuss a servant girl, he said finally, when a hostile scout crossed into our territory and threatened the safety of someone under my protection. I would think the elders of this pack have more pressing concerns. We have no more pressing concern than the future of this pack, Corwin said, his voice sharpening. You have 3 noble candidates arriving within the week, each one selected with great care to strengthen alliances this pack desperately needs. If your attention is elsewhere, my king, I suggest you redirect it before matters grow complicated. Damien rose from his chair, the movement sharp enough that even Corwin's composure flickered. I have given this pack every hour of my life since the day I took the crown, he said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of control that warned everyone in the room how close it sat to breaking. I will meet with your candidates. I will fulfill every obligation this pack requires of me. But do not mistake my patience for permission to dictate where my attention belongs. He left the chamber without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, already turning his thoughts back toward the kitchens, toward the servant girl whose name he could not stop repeating in his mind. Behind him, the elders exchanged a long, uneasy glance. He did not deny it, Marisol said quietly. No, Corwin agreed, his jaw tight. He did not. Outside, the sky had begun to cloud over, gray and heavy, promising rain before nightfall. Damien walked the halls of his own estate feeling, for the first time in years, as though the ground beneath him had shifted, as though every careful plan he had built his life around was about to be tested by something far stronger than duty, far older than tradition, and far more dangerous to ignore than any enemy scout crossing his borders in the dark. 3 carriages rolled through the front gates of the Ashgrove estate before the week was out, and by evening, the entire staff was buzzing with the news that the noble candidates had finally arrived. Alira heard about it while scrubbing pots in the kitchen, half listening as 2 other servants argued over which candidate was the most beautiful, which family held the most influence, which one the Alpha King was most likely to choose. She kept her eyes on her work and said nothing, though something uncomfortable twisted low in her stomach every time she thought about the word choose. It shouldn't have mattered to her. She was a servant. He was a king. Whatever strange current had passed between them in the courtyard that night belonged to fear and adrenaline, nothing more, and she had spent the days since telling herself exactly that, over and over, until the words nearly felt true. Nearly. She caught her first glimpse of the candidates the following afternoon, when the kitchen mistress sent her to deliver a tray of refreshments to the receiving hall. The 3 young women sat in a neat row along a long velvet couch, each one dressed in fine silks that probably cost more than Alira would earn in a year. The first, Lady Odette, had sharp dark eyes and an even sharper smile, the kind that seemed to measure every person in the room and calculate their usefulness. The second, Lady Vesper, was softer in appearance, golden-haired and quiet, though something watchful lingered behind her polite expression. The third candidate, a woman named Isolde, laughed loudly at something one of the guards said, clearly enjoying the attention of every man in the room. Alira set the tray down quietly and moved to leave, but Lady Odette's voice stopped her. You there. Servant girl. Alira turned back, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. My lady? Is it true the Alpha King himself rescued a kitchen maid from an intruder last week? Odette asked, her tone light, almost bored, though her eyes had sharpened with interest. The staff downstairs won't stop whispering about it. Alira's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. I couldn't say, my lady. I only heard the same rumors as everyone else. How curious, Odette said, studying her a moment longer than felt comfortable. The maids downstairs described her as having hair much like yours. There are many servants in this estate with dark hair, my lady, Elira said carefully. I imagine it's simply a coincidence. Odette's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes went cold and calculating. Of course, a coincidence. She waved a dismissive hand. You may go. Elira left the receiving hall as quickly as she could, without appearing to flee, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself, Odette's questions meant nothing. Idle curiosity born of gossip and boredom, nothing more. But some instinct she couldn't name warned her otherwise, warned her that Lady Odette was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and that being noticed by someone like that was rarely a safe position for a servant girl to be in. That evening, Damien sat through a formal dinner with the 3 candidates, enduring 3 hours of careful conversation, calculated charm, and questions designed to reveal his preferences without appearing too forward. He answered politely, engaged when necessary, and felt, through every long minute of it, absolutely nothing stir within him. His wolf remained utterly indifferent, lounging in some quiet corner of his mind, unbothered by beauty or wit, or the practiced laughter of women who had been raised their entire lives to become someone's Luna. It was almost insulting, how little any of them moved him. He excused himself as soon as etiquette allowed, claiming pack business that required his attention, and made his way toward the private gardens at the rear of the estate, the one place he could reliably find quiet at this hour. He told himself he simply needed air, needed distance from the suffocating performance of the dinner table. He did not let himself examine too closely why his feet carried him toward the one part of the estate where he knew, from careful and entirely unintentional observation over the past several days, that Elira sometimes walked in the evenings after her duties ended. He found her exactly where some quiet, hopeful part of him had wanted her to be, sitting on a low stone bench near the fountain, her knees drawn up, staring at the water with an expression he couldn't quite read. She startled when she noticed him, rising quickly, smoothing her simple dress with nervous hands. My lord, I didn't realize anyone else came out here. I could say the same, he said, though he made no move to leave. How is your throat? Her hand rose briefly to the faint mark still visible along her skin. Healing well. Thank you again for that night. I don't think I properly expressed how grateful I am. You don't need to keep thanking me, he said, taking a slow step closer, close enough that the scent of her, warm and familiar in a way that still unsettled him, wrapped around his senses. I would have done the same for anyone. It was, he realized the moment he said it, a lie, and something in Elira's expression told him she suspected as much, though she said nothing to challenge it. The candidates arrived, she said instead, her tone carefully neutral. I imagine the estate will be very busy this week. Very, he agreed, though the word came out flat, unenthusiastic. Elira studied him for a moment, curiosity flickering behind her caution. You don't seem pleased about it. Damien let out a short, humorless laugh. The elders have arranged for 3 women to compete for the position of Luna, each one selected for the alliances they represent, rather than anything resembling genuine connection. Forgive me if I struggle to summon enthusiasm. That sounds lonely, Elira said quietly, and something in the simple honesty of the observation struck him harder than any of the calculated flattery he'd endured all evening. It is, he admitted, surprising himself with how easily the truth slipped out around her. Being Alpha King is not the life anyone imagines it to be. Every choice belongs to the pack, before it belongs to me. Every choice? Elira asked, tilting her head slightly. Something shifted in his expression, something that made her breath catch. Not every choice, he said quietly. Not the ones that matter most. The air between them grew heavy with something neither of them dared name. Elira felt her heart pounding, felt the pull of him even though every rational part of her mind screamed that this was dangerous ground, that whatever lived in his eyes when he looked at her could not lead anywhere good for a servant girl, with no family, no status, and no protection beyond her own 2 hands. I should return inside, she said softly, taking a careful step back. It's getting late, and I have an early morning. Damien did not stop her, though everything in his wolf howled at him to close the distance instead of letting it widen. Good night, Elira, he said instead, watching her retreat toward the servants' entrance, watching until the door closed behind her, and the garden fell silent, except for the quiet trickle of the fountain. He stood there a long while afterward, wrestling with a truth he could no longer deny. Whatever bond his wolf had forged with her the night of the attack had only grown stronger since, deepening with every stolen conversation, every quiet moment neither of them had planned. The elders wanted him to choose a Luna from 3 carefully vetted candidates. His wolf had already chosen someone else entirely, someone who scrubbed pots in the kitchen and carried bread across dark courtyards, and had no idea, not truly, how completely she had unraveled every careful plan the pack had built around his future. Unseen from an upper window, Lady Odette watched the garden below with narrowed eyes, having followed the Alpha King at a discreet distance after his abrupt departure from dinner. She had seen enough in those few stolen minutes to confirm every suspicion the servant's gossip had planted in her mind, and as she turned away from the window, her expression settled into something cold and purposeful. A servant girl, standing between her and the crown, was not a problem Odette intended to tolerate for long. The next morning brought heavy rain, drumming steadily against the kitchen windows, while Alira and the other servants moved through their usual routines, preparing breakfast trays and scrubbing the long wooden counters before the estate fully woke. Alira welcomed the mundane rhythm of the work. It gave her hands something to do, while her mind kept circling back, uselessly, to the conversation in the garden the night before, to the way Damien's voice had dropped low when he said, "Not the ones that matter most," to the warmth that had spread through her chest, despite every warning bell ringing in her head. She was still lost in thought when Lady Odette appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawing startled looks from every servant in the room. Noble candidates did not visit the kitchens. It simply wasn't done. "You," Odette said, her eyes finding Alira immediately, as though she had known exactly where to look. "A word, if you would." The other servants exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing, quickly returning to their tasks, clearly eager not to draw attention to themselves. Alira wiped her hands on her apron and followed Odette out into the narrow hallway beyond the kitchen, her stomach tightening with each step. "My lady, is something wrong?" Odette studied her for a long moment, the same calculating expression from the receiving hall settling over her features. "I saw you last night," she said simply, "in the garden, with the Alpha King." Alira's blood ran cold, though she kept her face carefully composed. "My lord came out for air, my lady. I happened to be there as well. We exchanged a few words, nothing more." "A few words," Odette repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "You'll forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, given how long the two of you lingered, and given the way he looked at you." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to something sharper, more dangerous. "I did not travel 3 days from my family's territory to compete for a crown against a kitchen servant. Do you understand me?" "I am not competing for anything," Alira said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have no ambitions toward the throne, my lady. I only serve this estate." "Then perhaps you should remember that," Odette said, "and remove yourself from gardens, from courtyards, from any place where our king might happen to wander in the evening. It would be a shame if your usefulness to this household came into question." The threat, delivered so calmly, so politely, landed harder than any shout could have. Alira understood exactly what Odette meant. A word in the right ear, a fabricated complaint about her conduct, and her position in the estate could vanish overnight, taking with it the only home and livelihood she had. "I understand, my lady," Alira said quietly, lowering her eyes. Odette's expression smoothed back into pleasant neutrality, as though the conversation had never carried any threat at all. "Good. I'm glad we understand each other." She turned and swept back down the hallway, leaving Alira standing alone, her hands trembling at her sides. She returned to the kitchen and threw herself back into her work, scrubbing the counters harder than necessary, trying to outrun the anxious thoughts crowding her mind. She had no illusions about her place in the world. She was a servant, orphaned young, with no family name to protect her, and no wealth to shield her from the whims of nobles who held far more power than she ever would. Whatever strange connection had grown between her and the Alpha King, however real it felt in stolen moments beneath moonlight, it could not survive against the combined weight of tradition, politics, and women, like Lady Odette, who had far more claim to a crown than a kitchen girl ever could. She decided, scrubbing furiously at a pot that was already clean, that she would keep her distance from him from now on. It would be safer for everyone, safer for her position, safer for her future, safer for whatever fragile piece still existed in her carefully ordered life. She almost believed she could manage it. That resolve lasted exactly until mid-afternoon, when a young page found her in the laundry room and informed her, with wide nervous eyes, that the Alpha King had requested her presence in his private study immediately. Elira's stomach dropped. "Are you certain?" Perhaps he meant one of the other maids. "He asked for you by name," the page said, shifting nervously on his feet. "Elira Vance. He said it's urgent." She untied her apron with shaking hands, smoothed her hair as best she could, and followed the page through the winding corridors that separated the servants' quarters from the private wing of the estate, a part of the household she had entered perhaps twice in 3 years, both times to deliver messages that required immediate attention. Every step closer to the Alpha King's study, she rehearsed Lady Odette's warning in her mind, felt the weight of it pressing down harder with each corridor she crossed. If word reached Odette that she had been summoned to his private study in the middle of the afternoon, there would be no explanation Elira could offer that would satisfy the noblewoman's suspicion. But she could not refuse a summons from the Alpha King. No servant could. Whatever consequences followed from this meeting, she had no choice but to walk toward them. The page left her outside a heavy wooden door, bowing quickly, before hurrying back the way they'd come, clearly relieved to be free of whatever tension hung in the air. Elira stood alone in the quiet corridor for a moment, gathering what composure she could, before raising her hand and knocking softly against the door. "Come in," Damien's voice called from within, low and steady, and something about the sound of it, even through solid wood, sent a nervous flutter through her chest that she immediately tried to suppress. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, finding him standing near the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture that radiated tension despite his stillness. The study was smaller than she expected, lined with shelves of old books and maps, a fire crackling low in the hearth against the gray afternoon chill. He turned as the door clicked shut behind her, and the moment his eyes found hers, whatever careful composure she had built on the walk over threatened to crumble entirely. "You wanted to see me, my lord?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "I did," he said, though he did not immediately explain why, studying her instead, with an intensity that made her want to look anywhere but at him, and made it impossible to do so. "Close the door, please." Her heart began to pound harder, every one of Lady Odette's warnings screaming through her mind at once. She hesitated only a moment before obeying, the soft click of the latch sealing them into a silence that felt suddenly, dangerously private. "My lord," she said carefully, "if this is about the garden last night, I promise you, nothing improper occurred. If anyone has suggested otherwise, that isn't why I called for you," Damien said, and something in his expression shifted, the tension in his shoulders deepening rather than easing. "There's been another incident along the border. My scouts confirmed it an hour ago." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something graver, something that made the fine hairs along her arms rise in warning. "The intruder who attacked you was not acting alone. He was sent specifically to test our defenses before a larger force. And Elira, the reports suggest they were not simply testing our territory." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "They were asking about you by name." The words hung in the air between them, and Elira felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "That isn't possible," she said, shaking her head. "I'm no one, my lord. I have no family left, no connections to any pack beyond Ashgrove. Why would anyone be asking about me?" "That's what I intend to find out," Damien said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "But until we understand why, I need you to stay close to the estate. No deliveries beyond the walls, no errands that take you near the borders, and someone with you whenever you leave the main household." "My lord, that isn't necessary. I can take care of myself." "You were nearly killed a week ago," he said, his voice sharpening with an edge of fear he didn't bother hiding. "I will not gamble with your safety, while whoever sent that scout remains unaccounted for." Elira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire crackling nearby. What could they possibly want with someone like me? Damien hesitated, and something in the careful way he chose his next words told her he had already considered an answer he didn't like. "Your parents," he said slowly. "You told me once, in passing, that they died in a border conflict when you were young. Do you know which pack was involved? Alira frowned, dredging up memories she rarely allowed herself to visit. I was too young to remember details clearly. I know they served this pack, and I know they died defending a border skirmish, but no one ever told me which territory, or why. She looked up at him, unease coiling tighter in her chest. You think this is connected? I think it's too great a coincidence to ignore, Damien said. I intend to have our record keepers search the old archives. If your parents were involved in something significant enough that it echoes 15 years later, there will be a record of it somewhere. The idea of digging into her parents' past, a subject she had long ago accepted she would never fully understand, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through her, equal parts hope and dread. She had spent years imagining her parents as simple, loyal servants of the pack, nothing more. The thought that they might have been entangled in something larger, something that still cast a shadow over her life all these years later, was almost too much to process standing in the middle of the Alpha King's private study. Thank you, she said quietly, for caring enough to look into it. I would do far more than that for you, Damien said, and the honesty in his voice, raw and unguarded, made her breath catch. He seemed to realize a moment too late how much he had revealed, and something like restraint settled back over his features, though it did nothing to erase what had already been said. My lord, I don't think I should be here, Alira said softly, taking a step back toward the door. If someone were to see, let them see, Damien said, though he made no move to stop her retreat. I am tired of hiding what I feel, Alira. You're the Alpha King, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You have candidates waiting downstairs, elders watching your every move, and a pack that needs a Luna who can strengthen this territory, not endanger it further. Whatever this is between us, it can only make things harder for you. You think I don't know that? He asked, closing the small distance she had created, his gaze intense and unwavering. I have known it since the night I found you in that courtyard. I have fought it every day since. Told myself it was simply gratitude, simply concern for someone under my protection. But my wolf has never once wavered, Alira. Not for a single moment. He knew you before I did, and he has not stopped reminding me since. Alira's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. What are you saying? I think you already know, he said quietly. Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock interrupted the moment, and Damien's guard captain pushed the door open without waiting for permission, his expression grim. My lord, forgive the intrusion. We've received word from the Northern Watch. He hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to Alira before returning to his king. There's movement along the border, a significant force, moving under cover of the storm. We believe they intend to strike before nightfall. Damien's entire posture shifted, the warmth in his expression hardening instantly into something sharp and commanding. How many? Enough to concern us, the guard said. The elders have already been notified. They're gathering in the war room. Damien turned back to Alira, his hand briefly finding hers, a fleeting, urgent touch that carried more reassurance than words could have managed. Stay inside the main household. Do not leave for any reason until I send word that it's safe. Be careful, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, raw with a fear she no longer had the strength to hide. Something flickered across his face, something almost like a smile despite the gravity of the moment. Always, he said, and then he was gone, moving quickly down the corridor with his guard captain, leaving Alira alone in the study, with her heart still racing, and 1,000 questions crowding her mind. She made her way back toward the servants' quarters in a daze, the weight of everything she had just learned pressing down on her. Her parents, whoever they truly were, had apparently left behind a mystery large enough to draw enemies across pack borders 15 years after their deaths. The Alpha King had all but confirmed, in the middle of a private study, with a storm gathering outside, that his wolf had chosen her as his mate. And now, somewhere beyond the estate walls, an army was moving through the rain, and she had no way of knowing whether any of this, the mystery, the bond, the fragile hope blooming despite every warning in her mind, would survive whatever was coming. By evening, the entire estate had transformed into something tense and watchful, servants moving quickly and quietly through the halls, warriors gathering in the courtyards, the storm outside growing heavier with every passing hour. Alira found herself in the kitchens once more, though no one expected real work from anyone that night. Fear had settled over the household like a second storm, quieter but no less powerful than the one raging outside. She was helping another servant girl named Wren carry supplies toward the estate's lower levels, where the household would shelter if the fighting drew too close, when a commotion at the front entrance drew everyone's attention. Elira set down the crate she was carrying and moved toward the sound, curiosity overriding caution. Lady Odette stood near the entrance hall, arguing sharply with one of the guards, her composed elegance from earlier days entirely abandoned in favor of open frustration. "I demand to know what is happening," Odette snapped. "No one will give me a straight answer." "My lady, I've told you. There is a border conflict underway. For your safety, you and the other candidates should remain in the eastern wing until—" "I am aware there is a conflict," Odette interrupted. "What I want to know is why the Alpha King rode out personally instead of sending his warriors, and why half the household seems more concerned with the safety of a kitchen servant than with the candidates his own elders selected for him." The guard's expression flickered with discomfort, clearly unwilling to answer honestly. Elira, standing at the edge of the hall, felt her stomach twist. She hadn't realized Damien had ridden out himself, hadn't fully understood, until this moment, exactly how much danger he had walked into. Wren tugged gently at her sleeve. "Come on, standing here won't help him." Elira allowed herself to be pulled away, though her thoughts remained fixed on the storm outside, on the man who had promised to be careful, on the growing, undeniable truth that whatever bond had formed between them now carried a weight far heavier than either of them had first understood. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, thunder rolled across the darkened sky, and Elira found herself praying, for the first time in years, that whatever gods watched over the Ashgrove pack were listening tonight. Rain lashed against Damien's fur as he led a line of warriors through the dense tree line separating Ashgrove territory from the contested borderland. His wolf moved fast and low across the muddy ground, senses sharpened past anything ordinary, tracking the scent of unfamiliar wolves cutting through the storm ahead. Beside him ran Finn, the young warrior who had escorted Elira home the night of the attack, along with a dozen others, all moving in practiced silence despite the chaos of the weather around them. They found the intruding force gathered in a shallow valley just beyond the border markers, a group larger than the scouting reports had suggested, perhaps 30 strong, wolves and armed fighters both, clearly prepared for a serious incursion rather than a simple test of defenses. Damien felt his wolf's hackles rise the instant the enemy force came into view, felt the familiar cold clarity settle over his mind that always arrived in the moments before violence became unavoidable. He shifted back to his human form, just long enough to address his warriors, his voice cutting through the rain. "We hold the border. We do not let a single one of them cross into Ashgrove land tonight. Understood?" A chorus of low growls answered him, determined and unified, and then there was no more time for words. The battle that followed was brutal and fast, bodies moving through mud and rain, the clash of steel and claws echoing across the valley beneath the storm's relentless drumming. Damien fought at the front of his warriors, his wolf form tearing through the enemy line with a ferocity that even his own warriors found difficult to match, driven by something far more powerful than duty alone. Every enemy that fell reminded him, in some distant corner of his mind, of the servant girl waiting behind the estate walls, of the mystery surrounding her parents, of the very real possibility that this attack, and the one before it, were somehow connected to her. He fought like a man protecting something he could not afford to lose. The enemy force, though larger in number, had not anticipated the ferocity of the Ashgrove response, nor the speed with which their Alpha King had mobilized. Within the hour, their formation broke, scattering back across the border under the cover of the storm, leaving behind several of their own who had not survived the encounter, and offering no explanation for their sudden, aggressive incursion. Damien allowed himself only a moment to catch his breath before turning to one of his warriors, a scarred veteran named Callum, who had served the Ashgrove pack for over a decade. "Take 3 others, and see if any of them can be questioned before they die of their wounds. I want to know who sent them, and why." Callum nodded and moved off into the rain, and Damien stood alone for a moment amid the aftermath of battle, his wolf finally beginning to settle now that the immediate danger had passed. He thought again of Elira, of the fear in her eyes when she'd told him to be careful, and something in his chest ached with the desperate need to see her safe with his own eyes. It was nearly midnight by the time he returned to the estate, exhausted, rain-soaked, and carrying grim news that he would need to share with the elders before the night was through. One of the captured enemy fighters had survived long enough to be questioned, and what little information he offered, before succumbing to his wounds, had only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The attacking force had not been sent by any rival pack seeking territory or resources. They had been sent, according to the dying man's fractured confession, on the orders of someone seeking information about a servant girl living within Ashgrove's walls, someone who had apparently been searching for her for a very long time. Damien made his way through the quiet, storm-battered estate, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, and found himself, almost without deciding to, standing outside the door of the small room Elira shared with two other kitchen girls. It was well past the hour any respectable Alpha King should be found lingering outside a servant's quarters, and he knew it. And he found, in that moment, that he did not particularly care. The door opened before he could decide whether to knock, and Elira stood there in the dim light, clearly having heard his approach, her eyes widening with visible relief at the sight of him standing whole and alive before her. "You're safe," she breathed, and before either of them fully processed what was happening, she had closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce, unguarded embrace that had nothing to do with propriety, and everything to do with the fear she had carried through every long hour of the storm. Damien froze for only a heartbeat before his arms came around her in return, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her, letting the last of the battle's tension drain out of his body in the warmth of her embrace. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply standing together in the narrow doorway, the storm finally beginning to quiet outside. "I need to speak with the elders," he said finally, reluctantly pulling back just enough to look at her face. "What we learned tonight, Elira, it confirms what I feared. Whoever attacked you a week ago, and whoever sent this force tonight, they are searching for you specifically. This is far bigger than a simple border skirmish." Elira's face paled, though she nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. "Then we need to find out why. I need to know what my parents were part of, whatever it was that's followed me for 15 years without my knowledge." "We will find out," Damien promised, his hand rising to gently cup her face, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch all over again. "I will not let anyone take you from me, not the elders, not some hidden enemy, not anyone." "Damien?" she whispered, using his name without title, for what she realized, distantly, was the very first time. "What happens if the elders never accept this? What happens if choosing me costs you everything you've built for this pack?" He held her gaze steadily, certainty settling over his exhausted features. "Then I will find a way to make them understand, because losing you is not a cost I am willing to accept." Outside, the storm finally began to break, the heavy rain softening into a gentle mist as the first hints of dawn crept along the horizon, and standing together in the quiet aftermath of a battle that had changed everything, neither of them yet knew just how much harder the road ahead was about to become. The following morning, the pack elders gathered once more in the council chamber, this time joined by Callum, who had spent the early hours combing through the estate's oldest records, searching for any mention of Elira's parents. Damien sat at the head of the table, exhaustion still heavy behind his eyes, while Elder Corwin listened with visibly growing unease, as Callum laid out what little he had uncovered. "Her father's name was Tomas Vance," Callum began, spreading a handful of aged, water-stained documents across the table. "Her mother, Leora. Both served as low-ranking members of this pack, exactly as the girl was told growing up. But these records," he tapped a particular page, "suggest they weren't always Ashgrove. They arrived here roughly 2 years before Elira was born, seeking refuge from a neighboring territory." "Refuge from what?" Marisol asked, leaning forward. Callum hesitated. "The records are incomplete, deliberately so it seems. Several pages appear to have been removed entirely, but there's enough here to suggest that Tomas Vance was not simply a servant fleeing hardship. He carried something with him when he arrived, something valuable enough that the previous Alpha King granted him and his wife protection and a place within the pack in exchange for it." "What kind of something?" Damien asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "I don't know," Callum admitted. "Whatever it was, the details were sealed by order of your father, my king, and I don't have the authority to access those particular archives without your direct command." Damien's jaw tightened. His father had died 3 years ago, taking whatever secrets he'd kept to his grave, leaving behind a mystery that had apparently been simmering beneath the surface of the pack for over 2 decades, waiting for the right catalyst to bring it boiling back to the surface. "Unseal them," he said. "Whatever my father hid, I want it uncovered immediately." "My king," Corwin interjected, his tone carefully measured. "Before we go further down this path, I feel it necessary to point out the obvious. If this servant girl's parents were involved in something significant enough to warrant royal secrecy, and powerful enough to draw armed forces across our borders 15 years later, then her presence in this estate represents a danger to this entire pack, not merely a personal complication for you. Are you suggesting I turn her away?" Damien asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am suggesting," Corwin said carefully, "that whatever feelings you harbor for this girl, the safety of this pack must come first. If enemies are willing to send armed forces into our territory to reach her, keeping her here endangers every soul within these walls." The chamber fell into tense silence. Damien felt the weight of every eye upon him, felt the impossible position the elders were forcing him into, protector of his pack on one side, protector of the woman his wolf had chosen on the other, as though the two obligations could ever truly be separated in his heart. "I will not abandon her," he said finally, each word deliberate and unshakable, "but I will also not endanger this pack recklessly. We will uncover the truth of what her parents were involved in. We will identify exactly who is hunting her and why, and we will neutralize that threat entirely. Only then will this matter be settled, one way or another. And if the truth proves as dangerous as I suspect," Corwin pressed. Damien met his gaze without flinching, "then we will face it together, as this pack has always faced danger. What I will not do, Corwin, is sacrifice an innocent woman to save myself the difficulty of a hard fight." The elders exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke further against him, at least not openly. The meeting adjourned with an order sent to unseal the late king's private archives, and as the elders filed out of the chamber, Damien remained seated a long while afterward, staring at the faded documents Callum had left behind, at the names Tomas and Leora Vance written in careful formal script, wondering what secret his own father had guarded so carefully that he had taken it to his grave rather than risk it surfacing. Whatever it was, Damien understood now that it had already begun to surface regardless, drawn out by forces beyond his control, and that the coming days would determine not only Alira's safety, but quite possibly the future of the entire Ashgrove pack. It took 2 full days for the sealed archives to be located and transferred into Damien's private study, stacks of leather-bound ledgers and loose parchment that had clearly not been touched since his father's death. He spent the first evening alone, working through the material by candlelight, piecing together a story that grew stranger and more troubling with every page he uncovered. Tomas Vance, it turned out, had not simply been a wandering servant seeking refuge. According to his father's careful notes, Tomas had once served as a trusted advisor within a neighboring pack known as the Dusk Hollow Territory, a pack that had, over 20 years ago, been consumed by a violent internal struggle for power. Tomas had uncovered evidence of a plot by a rising Dusk Hollow leader named Cade Thornwood to seize control through treachery and bloodshed, murdering the rightful alpha and several loyal advisors in the process. Rather than remain silent, Tomas had smuggled proof of the plot out of Dusk Hollow territory, along with his pregnant wife, seeking protection from the Ashgrove pack in exchange for the evidence he carried. The late king had granted them sanctuary, hidden their true identities, and sealed away all record of the arrangement, likely to protect the small family from retaliation. It had apparently worked for over a decade, long enough for Alira to be born and raised within the estate, with no knowledge of the danger tied to her parentage. But something, it seemed, had finally shifted, drawing Dusk Hollow's attention back toward Ashgrove territory after all these years. Damien found the final piece of the puzzle in a report dated just 8 months prior, describing the sudden rise of a new Dusk Hollow alpha, a man who had spent the past 2 decades consolidating power and eliminating any threat to his rule. The name attached to the report sent a cold chill through him. Cade Thornwood, the very man Tomas Vance had exposed all those years ago, now ruled the pack that had once hunted him, and it seemed he had finally turned his attention toward finding and silencing any remaining evidence of his crimes, evidence that, according to the old records, Tomas had never fully surrendered. Somewhere, hidden and forgotten, Proof of Thornwood's original treachery still existed, and if Elira's parents had passed down any knowledge of its location before their deaths, then she herself might be the last living link to information that could unravel Thornwood's entire claim to power. It was not simply Elira that Thornwood's forces were hunting, it was whatever secret she might unknowingly carry. Damien called for her immediately, and this time made no effort to disguise the summons as anything other than what it was. When she arrived, pale and worried at the late hour, he laid out everything he had discovered, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock to a kind of quiet, devastated understanding as the pieces of her past finally clicked into place. "My parents were murdered," she said softly, sinking into the chair across from his desk. "Not killed in some random border skirmish. They were hunted, weren't they? By this man, Thornwood." "I believe so," Damien said gently. "The records aren't entirely clear on the circumstances of their deaths, but the timing, the location, everything lines up too closely to be coincidence." Elira pressed her hands against her eyes, absorbing years of assumed truth crumbling apart in the span of a single conversation. "Do you think they told me anything? Before they died? Some kind of secret I don't remember?" "I don't know," Damien admitted. "You were very young. It's possible they protected you deliberately, by keeping you ignorant of everything. It's also possible Thornwood's people believe you know something you don't, which makes you no less of a target, unfortunately. So what do we do?" she asked, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and steel that made his chest ache with equal parts pride and fear for her safety. "We prepare," Damien said. "Thornwood will not stop searching for you now that he's started, and we cannot assume the attacks so far represent the full extent of what he's willing to attempt. I intend to increase security around the entire estate, and I want you moved into the private wing, somewhere I can better ensure your protection." Elira's eyes widened. "My lord, that isn't appropriate. The candidates, the elders, everyone will." "I no longer care what appearances suggest," Damien said firmly. "Your safety matters more to me than anyone's opinion on the matter, elders included." Word of the arrangement spread through the estate faster than either of them anticipated, and by the following afternoon, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the household finally broke into open conflict. Lady Odette confronted Damien directly in the estate's main hall, her carefully cultivated composure entirely abandoned in favor of open fury. "You've moved a kitchen servant into the private wing," she said, loud enough that several passing staff members paused to listen despite themselves. "While the candidates your own elders selected remain housed in the eastern quarters, like guests waiting to be forgotten. Her safety is under threat," Damien said evenly, though his patience was clearly fraying. "This is not a matter open for public discussion, Lady Odette." "Then perhaps you should have discussed it privately, before humiliating 3 noble houses who traveled here in good faith," Odette snapped. "Or is it simply that you never intended to honor the elders' arrangement at all?" Damien's expression hardened into something colder than Elira had ever seen from him. "I have honored every obligation placed upon me since the day I took this crown. But I will not sacrifice the life of an innocent woman to preserve appearances for candidates who were never chosen by anything more meaningful than political convenience." Odette's face flushed with anger, though she seemed to realize, belatedly, that pressing further in front of witnesses would only damage her own standing. She offered a stiff, shallow bow and swept away down the corridor, though the fury in her eyes, as she passed Elira in the hallway, left little doubt that the confrontation was far from finished. That night, alone in the unfamiliar comfort of a guest chamber within the private wing, Elira sat by the window staring out at the dark grounds below, turning over everything she had learned about her parents, about Thornwood, about the dangerous shape her quiet, invisible life had suddenly taken. She thought of her mother's face, half remembered through the haze of early childhood, and wondered what secrets Leora Vance had carried silently to her grave, secrets that had apparently outlived her by 15 years, and were only now beginning to surface. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened the door to find Damien standing in the corridor, still dressed despite the late hour, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted quietly. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." "I keep thinking about them," Elira said, stepping aside to let him in, no longer questioning whether it was appropriate, too exhausted by the weight of the day to care about propriety any longer. "My parents. I spent my whole life believing they died protecting the pack in some ordinary skirmish. Finding out the truth feels like losing them all over again. Damien crossed the room and sat beside her near the window, close enough that his presence alone eased some of the tension coiled tightly in her chest. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish I could have given you easier truths." "At least now I understand," she said. "Even if the answers are terrible, not knowing was worse." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the dark grounds beyond the window, and somewhere in that quiet, shared stillness, Elira found herself leaning her head against his shoulder, and Damien found himself wrapping an arm carefully around her, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding without words that whatever storm was still coming, they intended to face it together. What neither of them knew, as they sat together in the quiet dark of that guest chamber, was that Lady Odette had already made a decision of her own, one born from wounded pride and cold political calculation, rather than any loyalty to Ashgrove or its king. Within her own chambers, she penned a carefully worded letter to her family, describing everything she had witnessed and heard regarding the servant girl's sudden importance, the mystery surrounding her parentage, and the growing tension it had created within the Ashgrove court. She did not know the full truth of Thornwood or Duskhollow, did not understand the danger she was inviting by speaking so openly of Elira's situation. She knew only that her family maintained trade relationships across several territories, relationships that occasionally proved useful for gathering information, or, when necessary, for applying pressure. If the Ashgrove throne could not be won through proper courtship, perhaps it could still be salvaged through leverage, through information that might convince the elders to force Damien's hand regardless of his personal wishes. She sealed the letter and sent it by private courier before dawn, entirely unaware that her family's trade relationships extended, however distantly, into networks that occasionally intersected with Duskhollow territory, unaware that information moved through those networks far less discreetly than she assumed, unaware that she had just placed the first domino in a chain of events that would soon spiral far beyond her control or intention. 2 days later, Elira woke to the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside her chamber, sharp and urgent, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. She dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway to find Callum and several other warriors moving with rapid purpose toward the estate's front entrance, their expressions grim. "What's happening?" she asked, catching Callum's arm as he passed. "A messenger arrived from the Southern Watch," he said, not slowing his pace, forcing her to walk quickly alongside him. "Duskhollow forces have been spotted moving through Allied territory, closer to our borders than any previous incursion. The Alpha's already gathering the council." Elira's stomach dropped. How did they know to move so quickly? "We only uncovered the connection to Thornwood a few days ago." Callum's jaw tightened, though he offered no answer, clearly unwilling to speculate aloud. Elira followed him as far as the council chamber doors before a guard gently but firmly stopped her from entering, informing her that the meeting required elder and warrior presence only. She paced the corridor outside instead, anxiety twisting tighter with every passing minute, until the doors finally opened, and Damien emerged, his expression carved from stone. "What did they decide?" she asked immediately. "We reinforce the border," he said, "and we begin preparing the estate for the possibility of a direct assault, should Thornwood grow bold enough to attempt one. Elira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Anything. Is there anyone within this household you've told about your parents recently? Anyone at all, even in passing conversation, who might have had reason to pass that information beyond these walls?" Elira's mind raced backward through the past several days, and slowly, uneasily, she thought of the confrontation with Odette in the hallway outside the kitchen, of Odette's pointed questions about the courtyard rescue, of the noblewoman's clear resentment over her presence in the private wing. "Lady Odette," she said slowly. "She confronted me before, asking questions about the night of the attack, and she's made her displeasure about my situation very clear, publicly and privately." Damien's expression darkened considerably. Her family maintains trade connections across several territories. If she wrote to them about what she's witnessed here, even without understanding the full danger of it, that information could easily have found its way toward Duskhollow ears. "You think she's responsible for this?" Elira asked, horrified. "I think it's a possibility we cannot ignore," Damien said grimly. "I'll have her questioned, carefully, without accusation, until we know more. But Alira, regardless of how this information reached Thornwood, the reality remains the same. He knows you're here, and he's moving forces toward our territory because of it. The confrontation with Odette, when it came that evening, proved far less dramatic than Alira had feared. Summoned before Damien and two of the elders, the noblewoman's carefully composed mask cracked within minutes of careful, pointed questioning, revealing the truth of her letter with a mixture of defiance and dawning horror, as she began to understand the true weight of what her small act of political maneuvering had potentially unleashed. "I only meant to inform my family," she insisted, her voice trembling despite her attempts to remain composed. "I had no idea, I swear it. I had no understanding of any connection to Dusk Hollow, or this Thornwood you speak of. I only wanted my family to understand why my courtship here had been so thoroughly undermined." "Your carelessness may have endangered this entire pack," Elder Corwin said coldly, his earlier suspicion of Alira momentarily forgotten in the face of a far more immediate betrayal. "Whatever your intentions, Lady Odette, the consequences remain the same." Odette's composure finally broke entirely, tears spilling down her face as the full weight of the situation settled over her. "What happens now?" she whispered. Damien studied her for a long moment, his anger tempered by the understanding that her actions, however damaging, had not been born from malice toward the pack itself, only from wounded pride and political ambition that had spiraled far beyond her control. "Your candidacy for Luna is withdrawn, effective immediately," he said. "You will remain within the estate under guard until this threat is resolved, both for your own safety and to ensure no further information reaches Dusk Hollow ears through any remaining connections you might attempt to use. After that, you will return to your family's territory, and I imagine they will have a great deal to discuss with you regarding the consequences of hasty letters." Odette nodded miserably, offering no further argument, and was escorted from the chamber by two guards, leaving behind a heavy, uneasy silence. "That resolves one mystery," Marisol said quietly, "but not the larger problem. Thornwood knows where the girl is now. Withdrawing a candidacy will not undo that." "No," Damien agreed, his gaze hardening with grim determination. "It will not. Which means we need to prepare for the possibility that Thornwood intends to come for her directly, and soon." Outside the chamber, Elira had been waiting anxiously for news, and when Damien finally emerged and relayed what had happened, she felt a complicated tangle of relief and dread settle over her in equal measure. The immediate mystery of the leak was solved, but the danger it had unleashed remained very much alive, gathering somewhere beyond the borders, waiting for its moment to strike. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly, the honesty slipping out before she could stop it. Damien pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close in the dim corridor. "I know," he said, "but I promise you, Alira, whatever comes, I will not let Thornwood take you from me. This pack has fought harder battles than this one, and we will win this fight as well." She wanted desperately to believe him, and standing there in his arms with the weight of an approaching war settling over the estate, she let herself hold on to that hope, even as some quiet, fearful part of her mind whispered that the hardest battles were often the ones fought closest to home. Preparations moved quickly through the following days, the estate transforming steadily from a household focused on courtship and tradition into one bracing for conflict. Warriors drilled in the training yards from dawn until dusk. Supplies were gathered and stored within the estate's lower levels. Messages flew back and forth between Ashgrove and its allied territories, seeking support against whatever Thornwood intended to bring to their borders. Alira found herself included in these preparations in small but meaningful ways, no longer confined entirely to the kitchens, though she insisted on continuing whatever work she could manage, even as her circumstances within the household shifted dramatically. She organized supplies alongside Wren, helped tend to warriors returning from border patrols, and spent quiet evenings with Damien whenever his duties allowed, both of them holding tightly to whatever peace they could find amid the mounting tension. It was during one of those quiet evenings, standing together on a balcony overlooking the darkened training yards, that Damien finally voiced the thought that had been weighing on him for days. "Whatever happens with Thornwood," he said, "I want you to know that my feelings for you were never dependent on unraveling your parents' past, or resolving this threat, or satisfying the elders' concerns. My wolf chose you the moment he sensed you were in danger, and every day since has only deepened that certainty. Illyra turned to face him, moonlight catching the emotion in her eyes. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "I've tried so hard to convince myself this was foolish, that a servant girl has no business falling for an alpha king. But I don't know how to stop feeling it, Damien. I don't think I want to anymore." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and for a brief, precious moment, the looming threat beyond the estate walls faded into the background, leaving only the quiet certainty growing steadily between them, unshaken by politics or danger, or the uncertain road still stretching ahead. 3 days after Odette's letter was uncovered, a Dusk Hollow rider approached the Ashgrove border under a flag of parley, requesting an audience with the Alpha King himself. Damien received the news with deep suspicion, understanding immediately that Thornwood was unlikely to request peaceful conversation without some deeper purpose behind it. But pack law required that parley flags be honored, at least long enough to hear what message the rider carried. The meeting took place at the border itself, a neutral stretch of open field between the two territories, with Damien flanked by a dozen armed warriors and the Dusk Hollow rider standing alone, exposed and clearly nervous despite the protection his flag was meant to guarantee. "Alpha Thornwood sends his regards," the rider said, his voice carrying poorly across the windswept field. "He wishes to propose a resolution to this unfortunate tension between our territories." "Speak plainly," Damien said, his patience thin. The rider swallowed hard. "Alpha Thornwood is aware that a woman named Illyra Vance resides within your household, daughter of Tomas and Leora Vance, former subjects of Dusk Hollow territory, who fled under circumstances my Alpha considers unresolved. He requests her return to Dusk Hollow lands, where matters concerning her parents' unfinished business may be properly settled." "Unfinished business," Damien repeated coldly, "meaning your Alpha wishes to silence the last living connection to evidence of his own treachery." The rider's face paled slightly, though he pressed forward with his rehearsed message. "Alpha Thornwood assures full and fair treatment of the woman upon her return, and offers, in exchange, a formal cessation of hostilities and full withdrawal of forces currently positioned near your border." "And if I refuse?" Damien asked. The rider hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver whatever answer had been prepared for this exact response. "Then Alpha Thornwood regrets that further conflict becomes unavoidable, and he wished me to remind you that Ashgrove's allies are few, while Dusk Hollow's reach extends farther than you may realize." Damien's expression remained perfectly composed, though the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior was evident to every warrior standing beside him. "Return to your Alpha," he said, "and tell him that the Ashgrove Pack does not surrender innocent people to cover the crimes of tyrants, regardless of the cost. Tell him also that if he sets one foot across this border with hostile intent, he will find that Ashgrove's teeth are considerably sharper than his spies have led him to believe." The rider bowed stiffly and retreated, disappearing back across the border with obvious relief at escaping the encounter unharmed. Damien watched him go, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger, before turning back toward his warriors. "Double the border patrols," he ordered, "and send word to every allied pack we've maintained relations with. If Thornwood intends war, we will not face it unprepared." When he returned to the estate and relayed the message to the council, the elders' reaction proved far more divided than Damien had anticipated. While Marisol and several others expressed unwavering support for his refusal, Elder Corwin remained troubled, his expression grave, as the implications settled over the chamber. "You understand what you've just done," Corwin said quietly. "You've guaranteed conflict with a pack whose full military strength remains unknown to us, all to protect one servant girl." "I've refused to hand an innocent woman over to a murderer to buy temporary peace," Damien said sharply. "If that guarantees conflict, then it was already coming, regardless of my answer today. Thornwood does not seek peace, Corwin. He seeks silence, and silence is not something I'm willing to purchase at the cost of her life." "And if this war costs the lives of every warrior within this pack instead?" Corwin pressed. "Have you considered that cost as carefully?" The chamber fell silent, every elder watching Damien closely, waiting for his response. He felt the weight of the question settle heavily across his shoulders, understood the terrible truth within it, that his choice, however morally certain it felt, carried consequences that extended far beyond himself and Illyra, into the lives of every warrior, every family, every soul who called Ashgrove home. "I have considered it," he said finally, his voice steady, despite the storm of doubt churning beneath the surface, "and I still believe that a pack willing to sacrifice its own people to appease a tyrant is a pack already lost, regardless of whether war ever reaches its borders. We will prepare. We will fight if we must, but we will not become the kind of pack that trades innocent lives for false peace." No one argued further, though the uneasy silence lingering in the chamber made clear that not every elder present felt fully reassured by his answer. That evening, Elira learned of Thornwood's proposal and Damien's refusal from Damien himself, delivered gently but honestly in the quiet privacy of the guest chamber they had taken to sharing evenings together in. She listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the situation settled over her. "You should have handed me over," she said quietly, once he'd finished. "Never," Damien said immediately, sharply. "Damien, listen to me. If this leads to war, if warriors die defending a border, because Thornwood wants me specifically, how am I supposed to live with that? How are you supposed to lead a pack that resents you for risking everything over one servant girl?" "You are not simply one servant girl," Damien said, taking her hands firmly in his. "You are the woman my wolf chose the moment he understood you were in danger. And more than that, Elira, you are innocent of whatever crimes Thornwood is trying to bury. Handing you over would not have purchased peace. It would have purchased complicity and murder, and I refuse to lead this pack down that road, regardless of the cost." Tears slipped down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "I'm frightened," she admitted again, the same quiet confession she'd offered days before, though the fear behind it had grown sharper, more immediate. "So am I," Damien said honestly, surprising her with the admission. "But I would rather face that fear beside you than live safely without you, Elira. Whatever comes, we face it together." She leaned into him, letting his arms wrap around her, letting the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat calm some of the anxious storm raging within her own chest. Outside, beyond the estate walls, the border remained quiet for now, though everyone within Ashgrove understood that the peace was temporary. A held breath before whatever conflict Thornwood intended to unleash finally arrived. 2 days later, that fragile peace shattered entirely. A scout returned from the Northern Watch at dawn, exhausted and bloodied, reporting that Dusk Hollow forces had crossed the border overnight, striking a small outlying farming settlement that fell under Ashgrove's protection. The attack had been swift and brutal, clearly intended less to claim territory than to send an unmistakable message, and the scout's grim account of the destruction left no doubt in anyone's mind that Thornwood had chosen war over patience. Damien gathered his warriors within the hour, the estate transforming rapidly from tense anticipation into full mobilization. Elira watched from the estate's upper windows as warriors assembled in the courtyard below, watched Damien move among them, issuing orders with the calm, commanding authority of a king, preparing his people for the fight of their lives, and felt something cold and heavy settle into her chest, a certainty that the quiet, stolen moments of peace they had shared over the past weeks were about to be tested by something far larger and far more dangerous than either of them had yet faced. Before he departed, Damien found her one final time, pulling her into a fierce embrace in the quiet of the corridor outside her chamber. "I need you to stay within the estate walls," he said, his voice urgent. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, promise me, you will stay safe within these walls until I return." "Promise me the same," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain strong. "Promise me, you'll come back to me." "I promise," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, both of them understood that some promises, however sincerely made, remained beyond anyone's power to fully guarantee. He kissed her then, brief and desperate, a fleeting moment of tenderness snatched from the jaws of an uncertain future, before pulling away and disappearing down the corridor, toward the courtyard, toward his warriors, toward whatever battle awaited beyond the Ashgrove border. Elira remained standing alone in the corridor long after he'd gone, listening to the distant sounds of warriors mounting their horses, of orders being shouted across the courtyard, of an entire pack preparing to defend itself against a threat that had followed her, however unknowingly, into every life it touched. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heart pound beneath her palm, and made a silent, fierce promise to herself that whatever happened in the days ahead, She would not simply wait helplessly within these walls, while others fought and bled on her behalf. She just wasn't yet certain what that promise would require of her. The ride north took the better part of the day, Damien and his warriors pushing their horses hard across muddy roads still recovering from the earlier storm. By the time they reached the outlying settlement, the worst of the attack had already passed, leaving behind smoldering buildings and grieving survivors, who described a force of perhaps 50 Dusk Hollow fighters, descending without warning, before retreating just as quickly, apparently satisfied with the message their destruction had sent. Damien moved among the survivors personally, offering what comfort and assistance he could, arranging for supplies and warriors to remain behind to help rebuild and protect the settlement against further attack. It was grim, exhausting work, made heavier by the knowledge that this destruction existed solely because Thornwood wanted to punish Ashgrove for refusing to surrender one innocent woman. "This isn't the last strike," Callum said quietly, standing beside him as they surveyed the damage. "Thornwood's testing our response, seeing how far we're willing to go to protect her. If we don't respond with equal force, he'll only grow bolder." "I'm aware," Damien said grimly. "Send riders to every allied territory we maintain relations with. If Thornwood wants war, he'll find Ashgrove does not stand alone." They remained at the settlement through the night, organizing defenses and tending to the wounded, and it was well past midnight before Damien finally allowed himself a moment of rest, sitting alone near a dying fire at the edge of the ruined settlement, his thoughts inevitably drifting back toward the estate, toward Alira, toward the promise he'd made her that he fully intended to keep despite the mounting danger surrounding it. He did not know, sitting there in the quiet dark, that back within the estate walls, Alira had reached a decision of her own, one born from the same fierce, protective determination that had driven Damien to refuse Thornwood's demands in the first place. She had spent the day pacing the halls of the estate, watching wounded messengers arrive with grim reports, watching the household brace itself for a war that existed, at its core, because of her. Every report of destruction, every account of Ashgrove lives lost or endangered, pressed heavier against her conscience, until finally, late that evening, she sought out Callum's second-in-command, a steady, dependable warrior named Garrick, who had remained behind to oversee the estate's defenses in Damien's absence. "I need your help with something," she said, finding him in the quiet of the estate's war room, poring over maps of the northern border, "and I need you to trust me enough to hear me out before you refuse." Garrick studied her warily. "The Alpha left specific orders that you remain within the estate walls, my lady." "I know," Alira said, "and I understand why. But I've been thinking, Garrick, about what Thornwood actually wants. He isn't attacking Ashgrove out of territorial ambition. He's attacking because he's afraid of something my parents left behind, evidence of his crimes that could unravel his entire claim to power. If we could find that evidence, if we could prove definitively what he did to seize control of Dusk Hollow, it would give us leverage far more powerful than any battlefield victory." "And you believe you know where to find this evidence?" Garrick asked skeptically. "I don't know for certain," Alira admitted, "but my parents lived in this estate for over a decade before I was born. If they hid something here, something significant enough to matter this much, there might be records, personal belongings, something left behind that the archives Damien searched wouldn't have included, since those were the late king's official records, not anything personal my parents might have kept themselves." Garrick considered this for a long moment, clearly torn between the explicit orders he'd been given and the genuine possibility that Alira's instinct might lead somewhere valuable. "Even if you're right," he said finally, "searching through old servant quarters isn't leaving the estate walls. I suppose I could permit that much, provided you remain within sight of guards at all times." Relief washed through her. "Thank you, Garrick, truly." The search began that same night, working through old estate records to identify where servants of Tomas and Leora Vance's era had once been housed, a section of the estate that had since been repurposed for storage as the household's needs changed over the years. Alira worked alongside Wren and two guards, sifting through dusty crates and forgotten furniture in a section of the estate that clearly hadn't seen regular use in over a decade. It was nearly dawn, exhaustion weighing heavily on all of them, when Wren's careful search of an old storage trunk produced something unexpected, a small, weathered wooden box tucked beneath a false bottom, clearly hidden with deliberate care rather than simply forgotten over time. Alira's hands trembled as she lifted the box free, brushing away years of accumulated dust, and carefully worked open the simple latch holding it closed. Inside, she found a bundle of old letters, a small leather-bound journal, and a folded piece of parchment bearing a wax seal she didn't recognize, though something about the careful, deliberate way everything had been preserved told her immediately that she had finally found exactly what she'd been searching for. She opened the journal first, her breath catching, as she recognized the careful, familiar handwriting from a few faded letters she still possessed from her mother, the only physical connection to her parents she'd managed to preserve through the years. Page after page detailed her father's growing suspicion of Cade Thornwood's rise within Dusk Hollow leadership, careful observations of secret meetings, of unexplained deaths among Thornwood's rivals, of financial records that didn't align with official pack accounts. The final entries grew increasingly urgent, describing her father's discovery of concrete proof, documents detailing a plot to murder the rightful Dusk Hollow Alpha and frame a rival for the crime, clearing Thornwood's path to seize power through manufactured legitimacy rather than open treachery. Thomas had copied portions of these documents before fleeing, understanding the danger of what he'd uncovered, hoping to use the evidence someday to expose Thornwood's crimes should the opportunity ever arise safely. That opportunity, it seemed, had finally arrived, 15 years and one devastating loss later, delivered into the hands of the daughter he'd never had the chance to explain any of it to. Alira sat back against the dusty crates, the journal trembling in her hands, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as she finally understood the full weight of what her parents had sacrificed, what they had died protecting, and what now rested, however unexpectedly, in her own hands to finish. "We need to get this to the Alpha," Garrick said quietly, his earlier skepticism entirely replaced by grave understanding of what they'd uncovered, immediately. "He's still at the border," Alira said, wiping her eyes and forcing herself back into focus. "How quickly can we reach him?" "By morning, if we ride hard," Garrick said. "But my lady, the Alpha gave explicit orders for you to remain within the estate. I'm not certain." "Garrick," Alira interrupted, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion and emotion still coursing through her. "This evidence could end this war, before it costs any more lives. I am not staying behind while people die over something I could have prevented by simply delivering the truth faster." Garrick studied her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties, before finally releasing a heavy breath and nodding. "Then we ride at first light, with a full guard escort, and may the Alpha forgive me for allowing it." As dawn broke over the Ashgrove estate, Alira prepared for a journey she never could have imagined herself taking weeks ago, carrying in her hands not just evidence of a tyrant's crimes, but the very real possibility of ending the war her own hidden past had accidentally ignited, unaware that Thornwood's forces, having learned of increased movement near the estate through channels of their own, were already moving to intercept exactly the kind of vulnerable, lightly guarded party she and Garrick were about to become. The small party set out just after sunrise, 6 mounted guards surrounding Alira and Garrick, moving at a steady pace along the northern road that would eventually lead toward the settlement where Damien and his warriors remained stationed. Alira kept the wooden box secured carefully against her chest beneath her cloak, acutely aware of the weight of what she carried, both literally and in every other sense that mattered. The morning passed uneventfully, the road quiet and empty beneath a pale, clearing sky, the previous day's storm finally giving way to something calmer. Alira allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that they might reach Damien without incident, that the evidence she carried might genuinely bring an end to the bloodshed before it claimed any more lives. Garrick rode close beside her, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line flanking the road, his posture never fully relaxing despite the peaceful morning. "Something feels wrong," he murmured, more to himself than to her, roughly 2 hours into their journey. "Wrong how?" Alira asked, her earlier hope curdling instantly into fresh unease. "Too quiet," Garrick said. "No birds, no movement in the trees. Stay close, my lady, and be ready to move quickly if I give the signal." Alira's grip tightened around the reins of her horse, her heart beginning to pound as the same uneasy stillness Garrick had described settled over her as well, an oppressive silence that felt, the longer it stretched, less like peace, and more like the held breath before violence. They rounded a bend in the road where the forest pressed close on either side, the path narrowing between dense trees that blocked much of the morning light, and it was there, in that narrow, shadowed stretch of road, that the silence finally broke. Arrows whistled from the tree line without warning, and the lead guard fell from his horse before anyone could react. Chaos erupted instantly. Garrick shouted orders, wheeling his horse to shield Alira, as more arrows cut through the narrow gap in the trees, striking 2 more guards before the remaining warriors could scatter for cover. Alira's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing her before she managed to steady it, her heart hammering as the wooden box pressed hard against her chest beneath her cloak. The one thing she could not afford to lose no matter what happened in the next few moments. Off the road, into the trees, now, Garrick shouted, grabbing the bridle of her horse and forcing it off the path, away from the open killing ground of the road itself. Around them, armed fighters emerged from the forest, dusk hollow colors visible on several, moving with the coordinated precision of a force that had clearly been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Alira's remaining guards fought fiercely, buying precious seconds as Garrick pulled her deeper into the underbrush, away from the immediate fighting, his own blade drawn and ready despite the impossible odds facing their small party. She could hear the clash of steel behind them, the shouts of dying men, and forced herself not to look back, focusing instead on staying mounted, staying moving, staying alive. "There's a stream a half-mile north," Garrick said, breathing hard as they pushed through dense undergrowth. "If we can reach it and follow it east, it connects eventually to the settlement road. We need to lose them in the trees." "What about the others?" Alira asked desperately, the sounds of fighting still audible behind them, growing more distant with every passing second. "They're buying us time," Garrick said grimly, "which means we cannot waste it. Move, Alira. Now." They rode hard through the trees, branches tearing at Alira's cloak and hair, her horse stumbling over uneven ground in its panicked flight. Behind them, she could hear pursuit, shouted commands in a language she didn't recognize, the crash of horses forcing their way through the same dense forest they were fleeing through. Garrick's earlier calm had entirely dissolved into fierce, focused urgency, guiding them through the trees with an instinct born of years, navigating exactly this kind of terrain. They reached the stream faster than Alira expected, its cold water rushing loud enough to nearly drown out the sounds of pursuit still crashing through the forest behind them. Garrick pulled his horse to a sharp stop at the water's edge, glancing back the way they'd come, with an expression of grim calculation. "We cross here," he said. "The current will help mask our trail. Stay close to me." They pushed their horses into the stream, the cold water rising nearly to their knees as the animals fought against the current, and Alira clutched the wooden box tighter against her chest, terrified of losing it in the water, terrified of losing everything, her life, Garrick's life, the truth her parents had died protecting, all of it swept away in a single desperate crossing. They made it across, scrambling up the muddy far bank, and had barely regained solid ground when 3 riders burst from the tree line behind them, having clearly tracked their crossing despite the water's efforts to hide it. "Keep moving!" Garrick shouted, wheeling his horse to face the pursuers, his blade raised. "I'll hold them as long as I can. Follow the stream east, Alira, find the Alpha, deliver what you're carrying, whatever happens to me." "Garrick, no." "Go," he roared, and the fierce, desperate authority in his voice left no room for argument. Alira turned her horse and fled east along the stream bank, tears streaming down her face, as the sounds of battle erupted behind her. Garrick's voice, raised in a warrior's cry, as he threw himself against 3 armed pursuers, to buy her precious seconds of escape. She did not look back. She could not afford to, not with the weight of everything she carried, not with Garrick's sacrifice demanding she survive long enough to make it mean something. She rode hard along the stream, branches whipping past her face, her horse's hooves splashing through shallow water, every muscle in her body screaming with exhaustion and terror in equal measure. Behind her, the sounds of fighting eventually faded, replaced by an ominous silence she refused to interpret, refused to let herself imagine what that silence might mean for the warrior who had just sacrificed himself to give her this chance. She did not know how long she rode before her horse finally stumbled, exhausted, forcing her to slow to a walk along the winding stream bank, her own body trembling with cold and fear and grief she hadn't yet allowed herself to fully feel. She was alone now, truly alone, carrying evidence that could end a war, deep within contested territory, with no guard, no escort, and no certainty that she was even moving in the right direction anymore. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and she froze, her hand instinctively tightening around the wooden box, her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain it could be heard for miles. "Show yourself," she called out, her voice shaking, despite her best efforts to sound braver than she felt, "or I swear I will scream loud enough to bring every warrior in this forest running." A low, familiar growl answered her from the shadows, and a massive shape stepped into the pale morning light, golden eyes fixing on her with an intensity that nearly broke her composure entirely. Damien's wolf had found her. Relief crashed through her so powerfully that her legs nearly gave out as she slid down from her horse, and by the time her feet touched the ground, Damien had already shifted back into his human form, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and pulling her into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "You're safe," he breathed against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I felt something was wrong, hours ago. My wolf wouldn't settle, and I rode back toward the estate as fast as I could, and then I caught your scent on the wind, mixed with fear and blood, and I thought—" He stopped himself, pulling back just enough to look at her face, his eyes searching her for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled with the aftermath of everything she'd just survived. "Damien, we were ambushed. Garrick, the guards, they were protecting me, and I don't know if any of them survived. I left him fighting 3 riders alone so I could keep running, and I don't know if that was the right choice. I don't know if he's—" "Slow down," Damien said gently, cupping her face in his hands, grounding her with the steady warmth of his touch. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." She told him everything. The discovery of the hidden box among her parents' old belongings, the journal detailing Thornwood's crimes, her decision to seek him out despite his orders to remain within the estate, the ambush that had shattered their small party along the northern road. By the time she finished, tears streaming freely down her face, Damien's expression had hardened into something cold and dangerous, fury barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. "We need to find Garrick and the others," he said, already scanning the tree line, already calling for the warriors traveling with him to spread out and search. "And we need to secure whatever you found immediately. If Thornwood's forces knew enough to intercept you specifically, someone within Ashgrove may have leaked word of your search." "Another spy," Elira said, horror washing through her at the thought. "Possibly," Damien said grimly. "Or Thornwood's forces have simply been watching the estate more closely than we realized. Either way, we cannot assume any further movement remains secret." They found Garrick nearly an hour later, wounded but alive, having managed against impossible odds to fend off his attackers long enough for reinforcements from Damien's search party to arrive and finish the fight. 2 of the original 6 guards had survived the ambush entirely, while the others had given their lives defending the small party's escape, a cost that settled heavily over everyone present despite the relief of finding survivors at all. "You shouldn't have come out here," Damien said to Garrick, as the wounded warrior was helped onto a spare horse, though there was no real anger in the words, only exhausted gratitude. "She wouldn't have made it otherwise," Garrick said through gritted teeth, clutching a bandaged wound along his side. "Whatever she's carrying, my alpha, I hope it's worth what it cost." Damien's gaze found Elira, still holding the weathered wooden box protectively against her chest, and something fierce and determined settled over his features. "It will be," he said. "I intend to make certain of it." They returned to the border settlement rather than risk the longer journey back to the estate, and it was there, within a small, hastily secured tent, that Damien finally examined the contents of the box himself, reading through Tomas Vance's careful journal entries with growing, grim satisfaction as the full scope of Thornwood's crimes became clear. "This is enough," he said finally, closing the journal with careful reverence. "This is more than enough. Combined with testimony from surviving witnesses of the original coup, if we can locate any who remain loyal to the truth, this could unravel Thornwood's entire claim to Dusk Hollow leadership." "What happens now?" Elira asked. "Now," Damien said, "we take this evidence and present it publicly, not just to Dusk Hollow's own people, but to every allied territory who might otherwise hesitate to challenge Thornwood's authority. A tyrant who seized power through murder and deception has far less claim to loyalty, once that truth becomes impossible to ignore. And if he refuses to acknowledge it, if he simply denies everything and continues the war regardless? Damien's expression hardened. Then his own people will see him for exactly what he is, a man willing to burn everything down rather than face accountability for his crimes. Either way, Alira, this changes everything. You've given us a weapon far more powerful than any army. Word of Garrick's ambush and Alira's dangerous ride reached the estate before they did, and by the time their party finally returned, the household had transformed the news into something between celebration and disbelief. Servants and warriors alike speaking in hushed, awed tones about the kitchen girl who had ridden through hostile territory to deliver evidence that might finally end the war Thornwood had started. Elder Corwin met them at the estate gates, his earlier skepticism visibly shaken by the events of the past 2 days. "I owe you an apology," he said to Alira, his tone carefully measured but sincere. "I judged your presence here as a liability to this pack. I did not consider that you might become its salvation instead." "I only wanted to help," Alira said quietly, still exhausted from the ordeal, still processing the loss of the guards who had died protecting her. "I never wanted anyone to die for it. War rarely offers the luxury of avoiding loss entirely," Corwin said, not unkindly. "But you may have just prevented far greater loss than what was paid today. That is no small thing, my lady." The formal use of the title, however unofficial, was not lost on Alira, and she caught Damien's eye across the courtyard, finding in his expression the same quiet recognition of how dramatically her position within this pack, within his life, had shifted over the course of a single desperate morning. That evening, as healers tended to Garrick's wounds and the household finally began to settle from the chaos of the day, Damien gathered his closest advisors to plan their next move, the journal and its damning evidence secured carefully within his private study. "We move against Thornwood within the week," he said, spreading a map of Dusk Hollow territory across the table. "We present this evidence publicly, before his own council, before every allied pack who might otherwise remain neutral. If we act quickly and decisively, we may end this conflict before it costs any more lives on either side. And if he moves against us first, once he realizes what we possess," Callum asked. "Then we will be ready," Damien said grimly. "But I do not intend to give him that chance, if I can help it." Alira, standing quietly at the edge of the study, felt a fierce protective determination settle over her own heart, as she watched Damien plan the campaign that would, one way or another, finally bring her parents' 15-year-old sacrifice to its conclusion. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still lay ahead, she understood now, with absolute clarity, that she was no longer simply a servant girl, caught in circumstances beyond her control. She had become something far more essential to the outcome of this war, and she intended to see it through to the end, whatever that end required of her. Later that night, after the advisors had departed and the study fell quiet, Damien found Alira sitting alone near the fire, still wrapped in a blanket someone had given her upon their return, staring into the flames with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and quiet resolve. He crossed the room and sat beside her without a word, simply offering his presence, understanding instinctively that she needed comfort more than conversation in that moment. "I keep thinking about the guards who died," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even know their names, Damien. They died protecting me, and I don't even know their names." "Their names were Aldrich and Byrne," Damien said quietly. "Both had served this pack for years. Both left behind families who will need support in the days ahead, support I intend to provide personally, for as long as they require it." "It doesn't feel like enough," Alira said, tears welling in her eyes again, despite how thoroughly she thought she'd already cried herself dry that day. "It never does," Damien said gently, pulling her closer against his side. "That is the terrible weight of leadership, Alira, and it will be your weight to carry as well, should you choose to stand beside me as Luna. Every loss, every sacrifice made in service of protecting this pack, becomes something you carry with you, always." Alira absorbed this in silence for a long moment, watching the fire crackle and shift, before finally speaking again. "Do you regret it, choosing me, when it's already cost so much?" "Never," Damien said immediately, firmly, turning to face her fully. "Alira, look at me. Whatever this war costs us, whatever sacrifice it demands, I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. My wolf did not choose you because it was convenient or safe. He chose you because some bonds exist beyond calculation, beyond politics, beyond even duty itself. You are not the cause of this war. Thornwood's crimes are the cause. You are simply the truth he's desperate to bury, and I refuse to let him succeed. Something in his certainty finally eased the tightest knot of guilt coiled within her chest, and she leaned into him fully, letting herself, for just a few precious minutes, simply exist within the safety of his arms, without the weight of war, or politics, or grief, pressing quite so heavily upon her. "Thank you," she murmured, "for believing in this, even when I doubt myself." "Always," he said softly, echoing the same promise he'd made her once before, in a courtyard bathed in moonlight, before either of them fully understood how far that promise would eventually be tested. The following morning brought a formal gathering of the full pack council, elders and senior warriors alike assembling to hear Damien's plan for confronting Thornwood directly. Illyra, invited to attend for the first time in any official capacity, stood quietly near the back of the chamber, still uncertain of her place within these proceedings, despite everything that had changed. Elder Corwin rose first to speak, and the words that followed surprised nearly everyone present, Illyra most of all. "I have spent the past several weeks questioning whether this pack could survive the disruption this young woman's presence has caused," he began. "I confess, I judged her a liability before I understood the full truth of her circumstances. Having witnessed her courage, her sacrifice, and the invaluable evidence she has provided against a genuine tyrant, I withdraw my earlier objections entirely. Whatever bond exists between our Alpha and Illyra Vance, I believe this pack would be fortunate to see it formally recognized." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Damien's gaze found Illyra's across the room, warmth and quiet triumph evident in his expression, despite the gravity of the war still looming before them. It was not a formal declaration, not yet, but it represented something significant nonetheless, the beginning of acceptance from those who had once stood most firmly against the possibility of a servant girl ever standing beside their king. "We are grateful for your support, Elder Corwin," Damien said, "though our immediate priority remains ending this conflict before it claims further lives. I intend to travel to Dusk Hollow territory personally within the week, presenting this evidence before Thornwood's council and any allied pack leaders willing to bear witness." "That is a considerable risk," Marisol observed. "Thornwood may simply have you killed the moment you set foot within his territory, evidence or no evidence." "A risk I'm prepared to accept," Damien said. "This war will not end through half measures, and hiding within Ashgrove's borders, while innocent settlements burn, is not a strategy I'm willing to pursue further." The council debated the plan through much of the morning, weighing risks and strategies, eventually settling on a compromise that would see Damien travel to a neutral territory, bordering both packs, inviting Thornwood to a formal confrontation, witnessed by allied leaders from across the region, rather than risking a journey directly into hostile territory. Preparations began immediately, messengers dispatched to allied packs, warriors selected for the journey, every detail calculated carefully to maximize both safety and the impact of the evidence they intended to present. Throughout the planning, Illyra found herself included more and more, her insight into her parents' history proving valuable as the council worked to construct the strongest possible case against Thornwood's rule. She spent hours poring over her father's journal, alongside Damien and the elders, identifying names and dates that might correspond to surviving witnesses, piecing together a timeline of Thornwood's rise to power that grew more damning with every detail uncovered. It was exhausting, meaningful work, and by the time evening arrived each day, Illyra found herself falling into an easy, comfortable rhythm alongside Damien, the two of them working late into the night, sharing quiet meals together, building something steady and real amid the chaos of the war unfolding around them. Whatever fear still lingered about the confrontation ahead, she found herself increasingly certain that whatever came next, she would face it not as a frightened servant girl, caught in circumstances beyond her control, but as someone with genuine purpose, genuine agency, standing beside a man who had chosen her, fully and without reservation, regardless of the cost. 5 days after Garrick's ambush, word arrived that Thornwood had accepted the invitation to a formal confrontation, agreeing to meet at neutral territory within the fortnight, accompanied by representatives from allied packs eager to witness whatever evidence Ashgrove intended to present. The news brought a mixture of relief and renewed tension through the estate, everyone understanding that the confrontation ahead, however carefully planned, remained far from guaranteed to end peacefully. Damien called Alira to his study that evening, the journal and its accompanying documents spread carefully across his desk, his expression grave with the weight of what lay ahead. "I want you to travel with me to the confrontation," he said, without preamble. Alira blinked, startled. "Me? Damien, wouldn't that put me directly in danger? Presenting myself before the very man who's been hunting me?" "It would," Damien admitted. "But your testimony, as the daughter of the man who first exposed Thornwood's crimes, carries weight no document alone can replicate. And beyond the strategic value, Alira, I want you there. I do not want to face this confrontation without you beside me." She studied him for a long moment, weighing the fear still churning in her chest against the fierce, growing certainty that she owed her parents' memory nothing less than seeing this through to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion required of her. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear underlying it. "Whatever it costs, Damien, I want to see this finished. For my parents. For everyone who's already died because of Thornwood's crimes. For us." Damien crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her close, both of them understanding that the confrontation ahead would likely determine not only the fate of the war, but the entire shape of the future they were fighting so hard to build together. The neutral grounds chosen for the confrontation sat within a wide, open valley, claimed by no single pack, historically used for exactly this purpose. Disputes too significant for private negotiation, requiring instead the presence of witnesses from across the region to ensure fairness and accountability. Damien arrived with a modest but well-armed escort, Alira riding close beside him, the wooden box containing her father's journal secured carefully within a leather satchel across her shoulder. Tents had already been erected across the valley by the time they arrived, banners from at least 6 allied territories visible among the gathering crowd, a clear sign that word of the confrontation had spread far beyond Ashgrove and Dusk Hollow alone. Alira felt her heart pounding as she took in the scale of the gathering, understanding fully, for the first time, just how significant this moment had become, not simply a private dispute between two packs, but a public reckoning that the entire region had gathered to witness. Thornwood's party arrived an hour later, and the moment Alira laid eyes on him for the first time, she understood immediately why her father had once considered him dangerous enough to flee across pack borders with a pregnant wife, rather than remain and confront him directly. Cade Thornwood was tall and imposing, his expression carrying the practiced calm of a man accustomed to controlling every situation he entered, though something cold and calculating lurked behind his composed exterior, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. "Alpha Ashgrove," Thornwood said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd as he approached the center of the valley where Damien waited. "I confess, I did not expect you to actually appear in person, bold, given the circumstances." "I do not hide from confrontations I believe in, Thornwood," Damien replied evenly. "Something you might have learned yourself, had you chosen honesty over treachery 20 years ago." A murmur rippled through the gathered witnesses, and Thornwood's composed expression flickered, just briefly, before settling back into practiced neutrality. "Bold accusations for a public gathering," he said. "I trust you have evidence to support such claims, rather than simply the desperate rumors of a servant girl seeking to elevate her own importance." Alira felt her spine stiffen at the dismissive insult, though she kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let Thornwood's calculated provocation shake her resolve. Damien's jaw tightened visibly, though his voice remained steady when he responded. "I have considerably more than rumors," he said, gesturing for Alira to step forward. "This is Alira Vance, daughter of Tomas and Leora Vance, former advisors within your own territory, before circumstances forced them to flee for their lives. She carries evidence that I believe every witness gathered here today deserves to see." Alira stepped forward, her hands steady despite the fear churning beneath her composed exterior, and opened the leather satchel, withdrawing her father's journal along with the copied documents he had smuggled out of Dusk Hollow territory 15 years prior. She held them up for the gathered crowd to see, her voice carrying as clearly and steadily as she could manage. "My father, Tomas Vance, served as a trusted advisor within Dusk Hollow territory, before discovering evidence that Cade Thornwood orchestrated the murder of the rightful Alpha, framing an innocent rival for the crime. in order to seize power through manufactured legitimacy. Fearing for his life and that of his family, my father fled to Ashgrove territory, carrying copies of the evidence he'd uncovered. He and my mother were murdered 15 years ago, killed by forces I now understand were sent specifically to silence them and recover this evidence. I only recently discovered the truth of what they died protecting. She opened the journal to a specific page, one she and Damien had marked carefully in preparation for exactly this moment, and began to read her father's own words aloud, detailing dates, names, and specific evidence of Thornwood's treachery, in language too precise and too damning to easily dismiss as fabrication. Thornwood's expression had grown increasingly rigid throughout her testimony, his earlier composed dismissal giving way to something sharper, more dangerous. "Fabrications," he said finally, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. "Conveniently discovered documents, presented by a woman with every motivation to invent whatever story best serves her position within the Ashgrove court. I would expect more credible evidence before accepting such serious accusations." "Then perhaps you would find the testimony of surviving witnesses more credible," Damien said calmly, gesturing toward the edge of the gathered crowd, where two figures Illyra did not recognize stepped forward, elderly, but clearly resolute, their expressions grim, with long-buried grief finally given voice. Elder Halric and his wife Ingrid served the rightful Dusk Hollow Alpha before his murder. They agreed to travel here today, at considerable personal risk, to confirm what Tomas Vance's journal describes. Thornwood's composed mask finally cracked entirely, as the elderly couple began recounting their own memories of that fateful night 20 years ago, describing suspicious circumstances surrounding the Alpha's death, describing Thornwood's suspiciously swift consolidation of power in the aftermath, describing the quiet disappearance of anyone who dared question the official account too closely. "Lies," Thornwood snarled, all pretense of calm finally abandoned. "This is nothing more than a coordinated conspiracy to undermine my legitimate rule, orchestrated by Ashgrove to weaken Dusk Hollow's standing among our allies." "Is that truly the accusation you wish to make?" asked a new voice, carrying authority that immediately silenced the growing murmur among the crowd. "Before witnesses from 6 territories, against evidence this detailed and consistent?" Illyra turned to see an older woman stepping forward from among the gathered allied representatives, her bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. She recognized the woman, distantly, as Alpha Rowena of the Silverpine territory, one of the most respected and influential leaders among the region's allied packs. "Alpha Thornwood," Rowena continued, her gaze hard and unforgiving. "I have known you for over 15 years, since shortly after you assumed leadership of Dusk Hollow. I confess, I always found the circumstances of your predecessor's death somewhat too convenient for my comfort, though I lacked concrete evidence to challenge it at the time. What I have witnessed here today, the consistency of this journal, the testimony of surviving witnesses who clearly have nothing to gain and considerable risk to bear by speaking, leaves me struggling to dismiss these accusations as easily as you suggest." A ripple of agreement moved through the gathered crowd, other allied leaders nodding grimly, their expressions shifting visibly, as the weight of evidence continued mounting against Thornwood's increasingly desperate denials. "This is absurd," Thornwood said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier commanding confidence, panic beginning to bleed through his composed exterior. "You would take the word of a servant girl and 2 elderly strangers over the word of an Alpha who has led Dusk Hollow faithfully for 2 decades? I would take the word of consistent, corroborated evidence over the denials of a man growing increasingly desperate before our eyes," Rowena replied coldly. "Cade Thornwood, I formally withdraw Silverpine's recognition of your leadership, pending full investigation of these accusations. I suspect I will not be the only ally to do so." The gathered crowd erupted into overlapping conversation, allied leaders conferring urgently among themselves, and Illyra watched, her heart pounding, as Thornwood's carefully constructed authority began visibly crumbling before an audience he could no longer control or manipulate through simple denial. Thornwood's gaze swept across the valley, calculating, desperate, before finally settling on Illyra herself with an expression of pure, undisguised hatred. "This is not finished," he said quietly, though his voice carried just far enough for those nearest to hear. "Whatever happens here today, girl, You have made an enemy who does not simply accept defeat gracefully." Before Damien could respond to the barely veiled threat, chaos erupted at the edge of the valley, shouts and the clash of steel cutting through the tense atmosphere, as several of Thornwood's own guards, apparently anticipating exactly this outcome, launched a sudden, desperate attack, clearly intending to silence the evidence and its bearers before the confrontation could conclude, in Thornwood's public humiliation and downfall. Damien moved instantly, shoving Alira behind him as his warriors closed ranks, weapons drawn, the neutral gathering transforming within seconds from a formal confrontation into a desperate skirmish. Allied warriors from multiple territories joined the fray as well, many turning their weapons against Thornwood's attacking guards rather than remaining neutral, the earlier testimony having already shifted loyalties too thoroughly for anyone to stand passively aside, while Thornwood attempted to silence the truth through violence. "Get her to safety," Damien shouted to Callum, who immediately moved to pull Alira back toward the relative shelter of the Ashgrove tents, though Alira resisted, refusing to simply flee while Damien remained in the thick of the fighting. "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, even as Callum tried to guide her away. "Alira, please." "No," she said, standing her ground despite the chaos erupting around them. "I've run from enough of this fight already. I'm not running now." Callum, recognizing the futility of arguing further, instead positioned himself protectively at her side, blade ready, while Damien shifted into his wolf form and threw himself into the fighting with fierce, controlled fury, cutting through Thornwood's attacking guards with brutal efficiency, alongside his own warriors and the allied forces who had chosen, in this critical moment, to stand against the tyrant's desperate final gambit. The fighting was chaotic but mercifully brief. Thornwood's guards badly outnumbered once allied warriors joined against them, and within minutes, the attacking force had either fallen or fled back toward Dusk Hollow territory, abandoning their alpha's desperate attempt to silence the evidence through violence. Thornwood himself attempted to flee amid the chaos, but Alpha Rowena's own warriors intercepted him before he could escape the valley, dragging him back before the gathered crowd, his composed authority entirely shattered, replaced by naked, undignified panic. "You would attack a neutral gathering," Rowena said coldly, standing over him, as he was forced to his knees before the assembled witnesses, confirming every accusation leveled against you today, through your own desperate actions. "Cade Thornwood, whatever legitimacy your claim to Dusk Hollow leadership once held, you have just destroyed it entirely, before witnesses from 6 territories." Thornwood said nothing, his earlier arrogance replaced by hollow, defeated silence, as the full weight of his exposure and downfall settled over him. Damien shifted back into human form, breathing hard from the fighting, and made his way immediately back to Alira, relief evident across his features at finding her unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling her close. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Damien, is it over? Is it truly over?" He looked toward where Thornwood knelt, surrounded by allied warriors, his fate now firmly in the hands of the gathered leaders, rather than his own desperate schemes. "I believe so," he said, "though what happens next depends on what the allied territories decide regarding Dusk Hollow's leadership going forward." That decision, debated at length among the assembled alphas over the following hours, ultimately resulted in Thornwood's formal removal from power, his crimes deemed too thoroughly proven and too publicly exposed to allow any continuation of his rule. Leadership of Dusk Hollow would pass, provisionally, to a council of remaining loyal advisors until a proper successor could be identified, one untainted by Thornwood's treachery, with oversight from allied territories to ensure the transition proceeded fairly and without further bloodshed. Alira watched the proceedings with a strange, hollow mixture of relief and grief, understanding that whatever justice had finally been served today, it could not undo the 15 years of loss her parents' sacrifice had cost her, could not return the childhood she might have had if Thornwood's ambition had never forced her family to flee in the first place. But it was something, a measure of accountability finally delivered. A war ended before it could claim further lives, and as Damien's arms settled protectively around her shoulders, while the allied leaders finalized their decisions, she allowed herself, finally, to feel something like peace settle over the exhausted, grief-heavy relief still churning within her. "Your parents would be proud of you," Damien said quietly, watching the same proceedings beside her. Whatever they sacrificed, whatever they were forced to hide, you finished what they started, Alira. You gave their deaths meaning. Tears slipped down her cheeks, though these carried none of the sharp, desperate fear of earlier tears shed throughout this long ordeal, only a quiet, cleansing grief finally given room to breathe. I wish they could have seen this, she said softly. Perhaps, in some way, they have, Damien said, pulling her closer against his side. The journey back to Ashgrove territory felt entirely different from the tense, uncertain ride that had carried them toward the confrontation days before. Word of Thornwood's downfall and Alira's crucial role in exposing his crimes had already begun spreading through Allied territories, and by the time their party crossed back into familiar Ashgrove land, they found the roads lined with curious onlookers, servants and warriors alike, gathering to witness the return of the Alpha King and the servant girl, whose courage had helped end a war before it could fully unfold. Elder Corwin met them at the estate gates once more, and this time, his greeting carried none of the earlier caution or reservation that had colored their previous interactions. The council has already begun discussing formal recognition, he said, bowing respectfully toward Alira, in a manner that would have seemed unthinkable mere weeks earlier. Whatever hesitation existed regarding your position within this pack, my lady, I believe today's events have resolved it entirely. Formal recognition, Alira repeated, glancing uncertainly toward Damien. As Luna, Damien said, his expression warm despite the exhaustion still evident from their journey. If you're willing, Alira, I know the past weeks have asked more of you than anyone should reasonably bear, and I would understand entirely if you wished for time, for space, before considering something so significant. Alira looked around at the gathered household, at warriors and servants alike watching with open curiosity and, increasingly, genuine warmth, at the estate that had become, over these tumultuous weeks, more truly home than anywhere she'd known since losing her parents 15 years ago. She thought of her mother's careful handwriting in old letters, of her father's courage in exposing a tyrant's crimes at tremendous personal cost, of everything they had sacrificed to give her a chance at a life free from the danger that had ultimately followed her regardless. She thought too of Damien, of his unwavering certainty from the very first night in that dark courtyard, of every choice he had made since to protect her, to believe in her, to stand beside her through danger neither of them had fully anticipated when his wolf first recognized her as his mate. I don't need time, she said finally, her voice steady and sure, despite everything they had endured to reach this moment. I know what I want, Damien. I have known for weeks now, even when I was too frightened to admit it fully to myself. And what is that? He asked softly, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer, already felt the same certainty radiating from her that had settled so completely within his own heart weeks ago. You, she said simply. This pack, this life we've built together, even through everything that tried to tear it apart. I want to stand beside you, Damien, as Luna, for as long as you'll have me. The gathered crowd erupted into spontaneous cheers, and Damien, heedless of the audience surrounding them, pulled Alira into a fierce, joyful embrace, lifting her briefly off her feet as relief and happiness finally broke free, after weeks of danger and uncertainty. When he set her back down, he kissed her deeply, unashamed of the public display, unashamed of anything, any longer regarding the woman his wolf had chosen, from the very first moment danger had brought them together. Then it's settled, he said against her lips, joy evident in every line of his exhausted, relieved features. Alira Vance, servant girl turned Luna, chosen not by the Elder's careful calculations, but by fate itself, and by every choice we made together to fight for this outcome, despite every obstacle placed before us. Around them, the household continued celebrating, word spreading quickly through every corner of the estate that the long, dangerous weeks of tension and war had finally concluded in triumph rather than tragedy, that their Alpha King had found not simply a Luna to strengthen political alliances, but a genuine partner who had proven, through courage and sacrifice, that she belonged beside him in every sense that mattered. The celebration continued long into the evening, the estate transformed by torchlight and music, the household finally allowing itself to release weeks of accumulated tension in favor of genuine, unguarded joy. Alira found herself surrounded by well-wishes from servants and warriors alike, many of whom she had worked alongside for years, without ever imagining the strange, unexpected path her life would eventually take. Ren found her near the edge of the courtyard, pulling her into a fierce hug. "I always knew there was something special about you," she said, laughing through happy tears. "Though I confess, I never imagined it would end quite like this." "Neither did I," Illyra admitted, laughing as well, the sound feeling foreign and wonderful after so many weeks of fear and grief weighing heavily upon her. Even Lady Odette, still confined under careful watch pending her family's response to the earlier scandal, sent word through a guard that she offered her genuine, if reluctant, congratulations, along with an acknowledgement that whatever resentment she had harbored, Illyra had clearly proven herself worthy of the position, through courage Odette herself could not claim to match. It was not quite forgiveness, but it represented, in its own small way, a measure of closure to that particular chapter of the ordeal. Amid the celebration, a rider arrived at the estate gates just past midnight, exhausted and travel-worn, carrying news that immediately dampened the festive atmosphere gripping the household. Damien met the messenger privately, his expression darkening steadily as he absorbed whatever grim report the rider carried, and when he returned to the courtyard to find Illyra, the joy that had lit his features mere hours earlier had been replaced by careful, guarded concern. "What's happened?" Illyra asked immediately, reading the shift in his demeanor with practiced ease, after weeks of learning to recognize every subtle change in his expression. "Thornwood escaped custody during the transfer to formal detention," Damien said quietly, pulling her aside from the celebrating crowd. "A small group of loyalists ambushed the transport party overnight, freeing him before Allied guards could intervene." Illyra's stomach dropped, the fragile peace of the evening's celebration suddenly feeling far more precarious than she had allowed herself to believe. "Where is he now?" "Unknown," Damien admitted grimly, "but given everything we know of the man, I doubt he intends to simply disappear quietly into hiding. A man who orchestrated murder to seize power once will not easily accept losing everything without attempting some final desperate response." "Do you think he'll come after us again?" Illyra asked, though some quiet, exhausted part of her already suspected she knew the answer. Damien's jaw tightened, his hand finding hers, steady and reassuring, despite the renewed danger the news represented. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should prepare for exactly that possibility, and hope, for both our sakes, that I'm wrong." Behind them, the celebration continued, oblivious for now to the grim news that had just reached their Alpha King, and Illyra found herself staring out at the joyful, torch-lit courtyard with a heavy heart, understanding that whatever peace they had earned today might prove far more fragile than either of them had dared to hope. Damien called a small, private council before dawn, gathering only his most trusted advisors to discuss the security measures required in light of Thornwood's escape. Callum, still recovering from the earlier confrontation, insisted on attending despite his injuries, his expression grim as they reviewed what little information the messenger had managed to gather. The loyalists who freed him were small in number, perhaps 6 or 7, Callum reported. Not enough to mount any significant assault against Ashgrove directly. But Thornwood has spent 2 decades cultivating hidden resources and quiet allegiances. We cannot assume his reach ends with the guards who escaped him last night. "Increase security around the estate immediately," Damien ordered, "and send word to Alpha Rowena and the other allied leaders. If Thornwood intends some final act of desperation, I want every territory prepared, not just our own." "And Illyra?" Marisol asked pointedly. "If Thornwood is desperate enough to defy an entire regional council's judgment against him, I doubt his focus has shifted away from the woman whose testimony destroyed his legitimacy." Damien's gaze found Illyra, standing quietly near the chamber door, and something fierce and protective settled across his features. "She remains under constant guard until Thornwood is recaptured or confirmed dead," he said firmly. "No exceptions, regardless of her own wishes on the matter." Illyra, exhausted as she was, found she had no argument to offer against the precaution this time, understanding fully now, in ways she hadn't quite grasped weeks earlier, exactly how dangerous a cornered, desperate man could prove, especially one who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill, rather than accept accountability for his crimes. As the council dispersed to implement the new security measures, Illyra found herself standing alone with Damien for a brief, quiet moment amid the mounting tension. "I thought this was finally over," she admitted softly. So did I, Damien said, pulling her close. But I promise you, Alira, whatever Thornwood attempts next, we will face it exactly as we've faced everything else, together, and with far more allies now standing firmly on our side than he could ever hope to muster against us. She nodded, drawing strength from his steady certainty even as exhaustion and renewed fear churned uneasily within her, and together they returned to the estate's private wing, bracing themselves for whatever final, desperate move Cade Thornwood intended to make in the days ahead. Despite the renewed danger, life within the estate continued in careful, guarded fashion over the following days, the household balancing preparations for Alira's formal recognition as Luna against heightened security measures implemented throughout every corner of Ashgrove territory. Warriors patrolled the grounds in greater numbers than ever before, and Alira found herself rarely alone, guards accompanying her even through the familiar kitchens where she had once moved freely and unremarked. She did not resent the precaution, understanding fully the stakes involved, though the constant vigilance served as a persistent reminder that whatever peace she and Damien had begun building together remained fragile, contingent upon a dangerous man's capture or death before he could attempt whatever final act of vengeance still burned within him. Damien, for his part, divided his attention between overseeing security preparations and the formal arrangements required for Alira's recognition, a process that involved considerably more ceremony and tradition than either of them had anticipated when she'd first agreed to stand beside him as Luna. Elder Marisol took it upon herself to guide Alira through the various customs and expectations that would accompany her new position, patient explanations delivered over quiet afternoon tea sessions that offered welcome, if temporary, distraction from the looming threat still hanging over the estate. The formal ceremony traditionally includes recognition from allied territories, Marisol explained one such afternoon, sketching out the general structure of the event across a sheet of parchment. Given recent circumstances, several allied leaders have already expressed interest in attending personally, partly out of genuine respect for your courage, and partly, I suspect, to demonstrate solidarity against whatever threat Thornwood still poses. Won't that make the ceremony a target? Alira asked, unable to fully set aside the cautious wariness that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. Security will be considerable, Marisol assured her. Damien has insisted upon it, and frankly so have I. But hiding indefinitely serves no one, Alira. This pack, and its allies, need to see their leaders standing firm and unafraid, even amid danger, particularly amid danger if I'm honest. Fear given too much power only emboldens men like Thornwood further. Alira absorbed this with quiet consideration, understanding the wisdom in Marisol's words even as anxiety continued churning beneath her composed exterior. When is the ceremony planned? 2 weeks' time, Marisol said. Enough time to properly coordinate security and allow allied leaders to travel here safely, but not so long that we allow fear to dictate an indefinite delay. 2 weeks. The timeline settled over Alira with a mixture of anticipation and dread, excitement at the prospect of a future she had never imagined possible for herself, tempered by the persistent awareness that a vengeful, desperate enemy remained at large, his whereabouts unknown, his intentions toward her almost certainly unchanged despite his very public downfall. That evening, as she and Damien shared a quiet dinner within the private wing, guards stationed discreetly but visibly beyond the chamber doors, Alira found herself voicing the fear she had carried silently throughout the day. What if he attacks during the ceremony itself? She asked. It would be the perfect opportunity, wouldn't it? Every allied leader gathered in one place, Ashgrove's attention focused entirely on celebration rather than vigilance. Damien set down his fork, his expression turning thoughtful and grave. It's a possibility we've already considered, he admitted, which is precisely why security will be tighter than any ceremony this pack has ever hosted. I won't pretend the risk doesn't exist, Alira, but I also won't let that risk dictate hiding you away indefinitely, denying you the recognition you've more than earned. I'm not afraid for myself alone, Alira said quietly. I'm afraid of what it might cost everyone gathered to celebrate with us, if Thornwood truly is desperate enough to attempt something during the ceremony. Damien reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Then we ensure the security is thorough enough that whatever Thornwood attempts, he finds no opportunity to succeed, he said firmly. I refuse to let fear of what he might do steal this moment from us, Alira. We have fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let him dictate the terms of our future any longer. She nodded, drawing what comfort she could from his steady certainty, though the quiet unease lingering beneath her composed exterior refused to fully dissipate, a persistent whisper of instinct warning her that Thornwood, cornered and humiliated before the entire region, was unlikely to simply fade away without one final, desperate attempt to reclaim whatever he could of the power and legacy he'd lost. She was right to trust that instinct. 3 days before the ceremony, a routine patrol along the estate's eastern boundary discovered signs of recent, deliberate surveillance, careful tracks, and a hidden vantage point overlooking the main approach to the estate, abandoned but recently used, suggesting someone had been watching the household's preparations from a discreet distance. Damien doubled security immediately upon receiving the report, extending patrols further beyond the estate's formal boundaries and stationing additional warriors at every possible approach. It could be nothing more than curious scouts from allied territories confirming security arrangements before their leaders arrive, Callum offered, though his tone carried little genuine conviction behind the suggestion. It could be, Damien agreed grimly, but I'm not willing to assume the best, given everything we know of Thornwood's desperation. Triple the watch along every approach. I want no blind spots remaining before the ceremony begins. The following 2 days passed in a haze of careful preparation and mounting tension, allied leaders beginning to arrive throughout the estate, their retinues adding both welcome reinforcement and additional complexity to the already considerable security arrangements. Alpha Rowena arrived personally on the second day, greeting Alira with genuine warmth, despite the formal circumstances of their previous meeting. I confess, I did not expect to find myself attending Aluna's recognition ceremony quite so soon after watching you expose a tyrant before 6 territories, Rowena said, a hint of dry humor softening her otherwise commanding presence. You've had an eventful few months, by any measure. More eventful than I ever anticipated, Alira admitted, managing a tired smile, despite the persistent anxiety still coiled tightly beneath her composed exterior. For what it's worth, Rowena said, her tone growing more serious. Silverpine stands firmly behind Ashgrove, regarding whatever threat Thornwood still represents. You will not face this alone, whatever comes. The reassurance offered welcome, if incomplete, comfort, and by the morning of the ceremony itself, the estate had transformed into something between a fortress and a festival. Warriors stationed at every conceivable approach, while servants worked tirelessly to prepare the grounds for a celebration that carried far more weight and significance than any similar event in recent Ashgrove history. Alira dressed carefully that morning, assisted by Wren and 2 other servants, who had become close friends over the preceding weeks. The simple servant's clothing she'd worn her entire life, replaced by an elegant gown that still felt, despite everything, somewhat unfamiliar against her skin. She studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment, hardly recognizing the composed, poised woman staring back at her, so different from the frightened servant girl who had once carried bread across a dark courtyard, entirely unaware of the danger and destiny that single ordinary evening would eventually set into motion. You look every bit the Luna this pack deserves, Wren said softly, adjusting a final fold of Alira's gown with careful, practiced hands. I still feel like the same person underneath all this, Alira admitted, managing a nervous laugh. That's precisely why you'll make such a good Luna, Wren said firmly. You haven't forgotten where you came from, even as you step into where you're meant to be. The ceremony itself began beneath a clear afternoon sky, the estate's main courtyard transformed with careful decoration, allied banners hanging alongside Ashgrove's own colors, gathered guests filling every available space, as Elder Corwin formally opened proceedings, with words that carried genuine warmth and respect, a stark contrast to his earlier reservations weeks before. Alira stood beside Damien at the center of the courtyard, her hand steady in his despite the nervous energy coursing through her, watching as elder after elder rose to speak, each offering formal recognition of her courage, her sacrifice, her worthiness to stand as Luna beside their Alpha King. The gathered crowd listened with rapt attention, and for a brief, precious span of time, the persistent anxiety that had shadowed every moment of preparation finally began to ease, replaced by something warmer, something that felt, however cautiously, like genuine hope for the future, stretching ahead of them. It was during Marisol's closing remarks, as the elder began the final formal blessing that would seal Alira's recognition as Luna before the assembled witnesses, that the first scream cut through the ceremony, sharp and terrified, rising from somewhere near the estate's outer wall. Chaos erupted instantly through the gathered crowd, warriors moving with practiced speed toward the sound, while guests scattered in confused alarm, the formal ceremony collapsing into sudden disorder, as shouted warnings echoed across the courtyard. Damien's hand tightened around Alira's, his entire posture shifting instantly from ceremonial calm into fierce protective readiness. "Stay close to me," he said sharply, already scanning the chaos for the source of the threat. More shouts followed, warriors calling out warnings of intruders, breaching the estate's outer wall, and within moments, the true scale of the attack became terrifyingly clear. A force considerably larger than the small group who had freed Thornwood from custody days earlier surged through a breach in the estate's defenses, clearly having used the distraction and crowded confusion of the ceremony to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Callum appeared at Damien's side within seconds, his blade already drawn, his expression grim. "It's Thornwood," he confirmed. "He's here personally, leading the assault himself." "How did he breach our defenses with that many fighters undetected?" Damien demanded. "Unknown," Callum said, "but there's no time to investigate now. We need to get Alira and the allied leaders to safety immediately." Damien's warriors moved swiftly to form a defensive perimeter around the gathered guests, allied warriors joining the effort without hesitation. The earlier festive atmosphere of the ceremony replaced entirely by the harsh, brutal reality of combat, as Thornwood's forces pressed deeper into the estate grounds, clearly intent on reaching the ceremony's central courtyard, despite the mounting resistance. "I need to get you inside," Damien said urgently, already guiding Alira toward the estate's main entrance, several warriors closing protectively around them. "What about everyone else?" Alira asked, watching in horror as the fighting spread across the courtyard, guests and warriors alike caught in the escalating chaos. "They have protection," Damien said firmly. "You are the one Thornwood wants most, Alira. Getting you to safety is the priority." They had nearly reached the estate's entrance when a group of Thornwood's fighters broke through the defensive line ahead of them, cutting off their path with brutal efficiency, forcing Damien's small escort into sudden, desperate combat. Alira found herself pulled back against a stone pillar, Callum positioning himself protectively in front of her, while Damien engaged the attacking fighters directly, his wolf form emerging in a burst of controlled fury that scattered two attackers within seconds. It was in the midst of this chaos, with fighting erupting on every side and the once peaceful courtyard transformed into a battleground, that Cade Thornwood himself finally appeared, cutting through the confusion with singular, focused purpose, his gaze locking onto Alira with an intensity that sent cold dread washing through her entire body. "You cost me everything," Thornwood snarled, advancing, despite the warriors attempting to intercept him, his desperation lending him a reckless, dangerous edge that made him considerably more difficult to contain than his earlier composed persona had suggested. 20 years of careful work, unraveled by a servant girl and her father's foolish sentimentality. I will not let you walk away from this having taken everything from me. Thornwood! Damien's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with fury, as he shifted back into human form and moved to place himself directly between the advancing tyrant and Alira. "This ends now." "It already has," Thornwood said coldly. "The only question remaining is how many more lives I take with me before it's finished." He lunged forward with a speed that belied his earlier composed appearance, a blade flashing in his hand, and Damien met the attack head-on, the two men clashing in fierce, brutal combat, while Alira watched, frozen with terror, Callum's protective presence the only thing keeping her from being drawn directly into the fighting herself. The battle between Damien and Thornwood raged with desperate intensity, each man fighting with everything he possessed, Damien driven by fierce determination to protect everything he had fought so hard to build, Thornwood driven by the reckless fury of a man who understood he had nothing left to lose. Blood was drawn on both sides, the fighting brutal and unrelenting, and Alira felt her heart pounding with terror as she watched the man she loved, locked in mortal combat, with an enemy who had already proven, repeatedly, his willingness to kill without hesitation. She could not simply stand by and watch. Her eyes fell upon a fallen warrior's dropped blade nearby, and before Callum could stop her, she darted forward, snatching up the weapon with trembling but determined hands. She had never fought with a blade in her life, had no formal training whatsoever, but as Thornwood pressed his advantage against Damien, forcing him backward with a series of brutal strikes, Alira understood with sudden, fierce clarity that she was not going to simply watch him fall while she stood helplessly aside. "Alira, stay back," Damien shouted, catching sight of her approach, even as he continued fending off Thornwood's relentless assault. She ignored him, circling carefully around the fighting pair, watching for any opening, any moment where her unexpected intervention might shift the desperate balance of the fight. It came when Thornwood, focused entirely on driving Damien back with a final, decisive strike, failed to notice Alira's approach from his blind side until it was nearly too late. She drove the blade forward with every ounce of strength and desperate determination she possessed, catching Thornwood across the shoulder. Not a fatal blow, but enough to disrupt his attack, enough to force a sharp cry of pain and surprise from the man who had hunted her relentlessly across weeks of danger and loss. Thornwood staggered, his balance broken, and Damien seized the critical opening without hesitation, driving his own blade home with fierce, controlled precision. Cade Thornwood collapsed to the courtyard stones. His reign of treachery and violence finally, definitively ended. The man who had murdered a rightful alpha and hunted an innocent family across 15 years, finally brought to justice by the very people he had spent so long trying to destroy. Silence fell across the courtyard as the last of Thornwood's remaining fighters, witnessing their leader's fall, either surrendered or attempted desperate flight, quickly subdued by the combined forces of Ashgrove and its allies. Damien turned immediately to Alira, breathing hard from the fight, blood staining his torn ceremonial clothing, and pulled her into a fierce, relieved embrace. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with equal parts fear and gratitude. "So could you," Alira said, trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the desperate intervention finally beginning to fade. "I wasn't going to just stand there and watch, Damien. Not after everything we've fought for." He held her close, both of them breathing hard amid the aftermath of battle, the courtyard around them slowly settling from chaos into the grim, exhausted work of tending wounded and confirming that the threat had truly, finally been eliminated. Allied leaders emerged cautiously from wherever they had taken shelter during the fighting, Alpha Rowena among them, her expression grim but satisfied as she surveyed the aftermath. "It seems," Rowena said, approaching the exhausted pair, "that your Luna's courage extends considerably beyond simply exposing tyrants through testimony alone." Alira managed a shaky, exhausted laugh despite everything, the tension of the past hour finally beginning to drain from her trembling body. "I never imagined my life would ever include something like this," she admitted. "Extraordinary lives rarely announce themselves in advance," Rowena said, a note of genuine respect coloring her words. "You've earned your place here today, Alira, in every sense that matters." The hours following the battle passed in a blur of exhausted activity, healers moving swiftly through the courtyard tending to wounded warriors and guests alike, while Damien coordinated with allied leaders to secure the estate fully and confirm that no remaining threat lingered among Thornwood's scattered, surrendered forces. Alira found herself sitting quietly on the courtyard steps, still wearing her torn and blood-stained ceremonial gown, watching the aftermath unfold around her with a strange, hollow numbness that she recognized, distantly, as the natural exhaustion following genuine terror. Ren found her there, settling down beside her without a word, simply offering quiet companionship while Alira processed everything that had happened. "You saved him," Ren said finally, softly. "I saw it. Everyone saw it. You saved the Alpha King's life today." "I nearly got myself killed doing it," Alira said, her hands still trembling slightly as she stared down at them. "But you didn't," Ren pointed out gently. "You're here, alive, and so is he, and that monster who's been hunting you for weeks is finally gone for good. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" Alira nodded slowly, though the full weight of everything that had happened still felt too enormous to properly process in the immediate aftermath. She thought of her parents, of the 15 years of danger their sacrifice had ultimately protected her from, until circumstances forced the truth into the light regardless. She thought of Aldrich and Byrne, the guards who had died protecting her flight toward Damien weeks earlier. She thought of every loss, every sacrifice that had led toward this single, brutal, decisive moment in the courtyard, and found herself overwhelmed by a complicated tangle of grief and relief that she suspected would take considerable time to fully untangle. Damien found her there as evening settled over the estate, the worst of the immediate crisis finally under control, his own wounds hastily bandaged though clearly still causing him considerable discomfort. He sat down beside her without a word, simply taking her hand in his, both of them sitting together in exhausted silence for a long moment, before either spoke. "It's truly over now," he said finally. "Thornwood is dead. His remaining loyalists have surrendered or fled. Duskalo's Provisional Council has already sent word confirming their commitment to legitimate leadership going forward, with Allied oversight to ensure no similar treachery takes root again. I keep waiting to feel relieved," Alira admitted quietly. "But mostly, I just feel tired. And sad, somehow, even though he's the one who caused all of this." "That's grief," Damien said gently. "For everything this fight has cost, even as it finally ends. It doesn't erase the relief, Alira. It simply exists alongside it, at least for a while." She leaned into him, careful of his bandaged wounds, and they sat together, watching the estate slowly settle from chaos back into something resembling calm. Servants beginning the long process of cleaning and restoring the courtyard, warriors standing down from their defensive positions as confirmation spread that the threat had genuinely, finally passed. "The ceremony," Alira said suddenly, remembering with a jolt that Marisol's formal blessing had been interrupted before completion. "It was never finished." Damien managed a tired, warm smile despite everything. "Then perhaps we finish it properly, once we've both had time to rest and heal. I refuse to let Thornwood's final desperate act steal this moment from us entirely, even if he managed to delay it." Elder Corwin approached as they spoke, his own expression carrying visible exhaustion alongside something warmer, more genuine than Alira had ever witnessed from the initially skeptical elder. "The council has already discussed rescheduling the formal ceremony," he said. "Given today's events, I suspect there will be no shortage of enthusiasm among both our own people and our allies to see it properly concluded, once everyone has had adequate time to recover." "Thank you, Elder Corwin," Alira said, genuine warmth coloring her exhausted voice, "for everything. I know I've caused this pack considerable upheaval since the night we first met in that courtyard." "You've caused this pack considerable upheaval," Corwin agreed, a faint, genuine smile touching his weathered features, "and also considerable pride, and ultimately, salvation from a threat that might have festered far longer, had your courage not brought it into the light. I believe on balance, this pack owes you a debt considerably larger than any inconvenience your presence initially caused." As night finally settled fully over the exhausted, battle-worn estate, Alira found herself, for the first time in weeks, allowing genuine hope to settle alongside the exhaustion and grief still churning within her. Whatever dangers and sacrifices had brought her to this moment, she had survived them, had helped bring genuine justice to a tyrant's crimes, and had found, against every improbable circumstance imaginable, a place and a purpose she never could have envisioned for herself, as a frightened servant girl, carrying bread across a dark courtyard, all those long weeks ago. The road ahead still promised healing, still promised the proper completion of a ceremony violently interrupted, still promised countless quiet adjustments as she settled fully into a role and a life so dramatically different from anything she'd known before. But for the first time since that fateful night the danger first found her, Alira allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the road ahead led somewhere genuinely good. Recovery came slowly over the following weeks, the estate gradually shedding the tension and vigilance that had defined nearly every day since Alira's first fateful encounter with danger in the western courtyard. Warriors stood down from heightened alert as reports confirmed that Duskalo's Provisional Council had taken firm hold of the territory, working steadily under Allied oversight to root out any remaining pockets of loyalty to Thornwood's discredited rule. Alira spent much of this quieter period healing in ways that extended well beyond the physical, the trauma of weeks spent as a hunted target, slowly loosening its grip as each peaceful day passed without incident. She still woke some nights from dreams of blades and blood and desperate flight through dark forests, and on those nights, Damien was always there beside her, steady and present, holding her until the tremors eased and sleep returned. "Does it get easier?" She asked him one such night, several weeks after Thornwood's fall, moonlight spilling softly through the chamber window. "It does," he said honestly. "Not because the memories disappear entirely, but because they eventually settle into something you carry, rather than something that carries you. I still dream sometimes of my father's death, of the weight of the crown settling onto shoulders I didn't feel ready for. The dreams come less often now, but they never fully vanish." "That's not entirely comforting," Elira admitted with a tired, wry smile. "No," he agreed, pulling her closer, "but it's honest, and I promised myself, somewhere along this journey, that I would always be honest with you, Elira, even when the truth isn't particularly comfortable." She appreciated that honesty more than he perhaps realized, the steady, unwavering foundation of trust that had grown between them through every trial they'd faced together, from that first terrifying night in the courtyard, through the devastating revelations about her parents, through war and betrayal, and, finally, hard-won victory. Whatever fear still occasionally surfaced in quiet nighttime moments, she found herself increasingly confident that whatever challenges the future still held, she would face them with someone beside her who understood, intimately, exactly what genuine partnership required. Not every challenge in those recovering weeks came from lingering trauma alone. Political complications continued surfacing as Duskhollow's transition proceeded, occasional messages arriving, describing minor pockets of resistance among Thornwood's most devoted loyalists, small disturbances that required careful diplomatic attention rather than renewed military conflict. Damien handled these matters with the same steady competence he'd shown throughout the crisis, though Elira found herself increasingly included in these discussions as well. Her insight into Thornwood's methods and mindset, gained through painful, hard-won experience, proving genuinely valuable to the delicate diplomatic work of ensuring Duskhollow's peaceful transition, succeeded fully. "You have good instincts for this," Damien observed one afternoon, after Elira offered a particularly insightful suggestion regarding how best to address a lingering loyalist faction's grievances without escalating tension unnecessarily. "Better than I expected, given how recently you were still working in the kitchens. Perhaps growing up watching how power operates from the margins teaches you things that growing up destined for power never quite manages to," Elira suggested thoughtfully. "I spent years learning to read a room, to understand what people truly wanted beneath what they said aloud. It seems that skill transfers rather usefully into diplomacy. Then this pack is fortunate indeed to have you standing beside its throne," Damien said warmly, "rather than simply serving within its kitchens." As the weeks passed and the immediate crisis fully resolved into stable, if still occasionally complicated, peace, preparations resumed for the formal completion of Elira's recognition ceremony, the celebration Thornwood's desperate final assault had violently interrupted weeks earlier. This time, security arrangements proceeded with the confidence of a threat genuinely eliminated, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had shadowed the earlier attempt, and the household approached the rescheduled ceremony with genuine, unguarded anticipation, rather than carefully masked dread. Elira stood once more in the same chamber where Wren had helped her prepare weeks earlier, though this time, the nervous anxiety that had accompanied that earlier preparation had given way to something calmer, steadier, a quiet confidence born from having already survived the very worst that danger could throw against her and Damien's bond. "No interruptions this time," Wren said firmly, adjusting the final details of Elira's gown with practiced care. "I've personally confirmed with 3 separate guard captains that security is absolutely airtight." "I appreciate the thoroughness," Elira said, managing a genuine, easy laugh, so different from the strained composure she'd maintained during their previous attempt. The ceremony itself proceeded beautifully. Allied leaders once again gathered in the courtyard, though this time the atmosphere carried genuine celebration rather than underlying tension, everyone present understanding fully the hard-won peace this moment represented. Elder Marisol resumed her formal blessing exactly where the earlier ceremony had been so violently interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, as she completed the traditional words recognizing Elira's formal position as Luna of the Ashgrove Pack. "By the ancient customs of our kind," Marisol declared, "and by the unmistakable bond recognized by both wolf and heart alike, I formally proclaim Elira Vance as Luna of the Ashgrove Pack, partner and equal to Alpha King Damian Ashgrove, protector and guide of this pack, alongside him, for as long as fate allows. The gathered crowd erupted into genuine, joyful celebration, cheers echoing across the courtyard, as Damian pulled Alira into his arms, both of them overwhelmed with emotion after everything they had endured to finally reach this long-awaited moment. Elder Corwin, standing near the front of the gathered elders, led the crowd in formal recognition, his earlier skepticism entirely transformed into genuine, evident pride. "Long live Luna Alira," he called out, his voice carrying clear authority across the celebrating courtyard, and the assembled crowd took up the call, in unified, joyful response, the sound echoing across an estate that had, over the course of these tumultuous months, transformed from a place of careful hierarchy and cautious tradition into something far more genuine, a home truly earned through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering love. As the formal ceremony concluded, and celebration spread throughout the estate grounds, Alira found herself, for a quiet moment, standing slightly apart from the joyful crowd, looking out over the gathered faces, allied leaders, and Ashgrove household alike, everyone who had played some part, large or small, in the extraordinary journey that had carried her from an anonymous servant girl to Luna of a pack she had come to love with her whole heart. She thought, in that quiet moment, of her parents, of the sacrifice they had made to protect a truth that had ultimately found its way, 15 years later, into her own hands to complete. She thought of Aldrich and Byrne, and every other life lost along this difficult journey toward justice and peace. She thought of Damian, standing beside her now, his hand warm and steady in hers, the wolf who had chosen her that first terrifying night, and the man who had never once wavered in that choice despite every obstacle placed before them. "Any regrets?" Damian asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression amid the surrounding celebration. Alira turned to him, her smile genuine and unguarded, carrying none of the careful reservation that had once defined her every interaction with the world, beyond the kitchens she'd once called her entire life. "None," she said simply. "Only gratitude, for everything that led us here, however difficult the path proved to be." He kissed her then, gently, amid the celebrating crowd, and Alira felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a genuine, unshadowed peace settle fully over her heart, the promise of a future finally free from the danger and uncertainty that had defined so much of her extraordinary journey toward this moment. In the weeks following her formal recognition as Luna, Alira found herself settling into responsibilities she never could have imagined shouldering during her years working quietly within the estate's kitchens. She oversaw household matters alongside longtime staff who now deferred to her with genuine respect, rather than the careful indifference she'd grown accustomed to as a servant, and she began, gradually, to develop her own particular strengths within the role, drawing on her intimate understanding of the estate's daily operations to improve conditions for the very servants she'd once worked alongside. She established, within her first month as Luna, a formal fund dedicated to supporting the families of warriors who fell in service to the pack, inspired directly by her own experience watching guards like Aldrich and Byrne sacrifice their lives in her protection, without ever receiving proper, lasting recognition for that sacrifice. Damian supported the initiative wholeheartedly, and within weeks, the fund had already begun providing meaningful support to families who had lost loved ones during the recent conflict, a tangible legacy born from painful, hard-won understanding of exactly what such sacrifice cost. "You've changed things here already," Damian observed one evening, reviewing the fund's early progress alongside her in his study, "in ways I confess I never considered addressing myself, despite years of ruling this pack." "Perhaps that's precisely why my wolf chose someone like you," Alira suggested, a teasing warmth coloring her words. "To notice the things a king raised entirely within privilege might otherwise overlook." "Perhaps," Damian agreed, pulling her close with an easy affection that had grown steadily more natural between them with each passing week of settled, hard-won peace. "Though I suspect my wolf simply recognized something considerably more essential than practical usefulness alone." She smiled against his shoulder, savoring the quiet, comfortable intimacy of moments like this, so different from the desperate, fear-driven urgency that had characterized so much of their earlier connection. This was what she had fought so hard to earn, she reflected. Not simply survival, Not simply justice for her parents' sacrifice, but this, quiet evenings spent building a genuine life together, free from the constant shadow of danger that had once defined nearly every interaction between them. One afternoon, several months after Thornwood's fall, Elira requested Damien's company for a particular errand she had been planning quietly for weeks, one she hadn't yet explained fully even to him. He agreed without hesitation, curious but willing to follow her lead, and she guided him toward a quiet, secluded corner of the estate grounds, near an old oak tree that had stood, according to estate records, since long before either of their lifetimes. "I want to build something here," she said, gesturing toward the peaceful clearing beneath the tree's spreading branches. "A memorial. For my parents, and for everyone who died protecting the truth they uncovered. Aldrich and Byrne, the guards who fell during the ambush, everyone whose sacrifice made this peace possible." Damien studied the quiet clearing thoughtfully, understanding immediately the significance of what she proposed. "I think that's a beautiful idea," he said, "and overdue, honestly. This pack owes considerable debt to sacrifices that have gone largely unmarked beyond private grief." They worked together over the following weeks to design the memorial, consulting with estate craftsmen and gathering input from the families of those they intended to honor. And by early autumn, a simple but deeply meaningful stone memorial stood beneath the ancient oak, carved with the names of everyone whose sacrifice had ultimately secured the peace the pack now enjoyed. Elira visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Damien, finding a particular, healing comfort in tending the small garden that had grown up around the memorial's base, a living testament to loss transformed, gradually, into something resembling peace. It was during one such quiet visit, several months into her role as Luna, that Elira found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that first terrifying night in the western courtyard. She had arrived at Ashgrove as an orphaned child, with no knowledge of the danger tied to her parentage, had spent years believing herself simply an anonymous servant, destined for an unremarkable life within the estate's kitchens. Instead, she had uncovered a legacy of courage and sacrifice, had fought through danger and grief to bring genuine justice to a tyrant's crimes, and had found, against every improbable circumstance, genuine love and purpose beside a man whose wolf had recognized something in her that even she herself had struggled to fully believe in during those early, uncertain days. "Your parents would be proud," Damien said softly, finding her seated near the memorial one quiet autumn afternoon, sunlight filtering gently through the oak's changing leaves. "Not just of what you accomplished in exposing Thornwood, but of who you've become through all of it. Steady, compassionate, genuinely wise in ways that continue to surprise even the most experienced elders within this pack." "I like to think so," Elira said, leaning into his familiar warmth as he settled beside her. "Though I still find myself wishing, sometimes, that I could have known them properly, could have asked them directly about everything they sacrificed, rather than piecing it together after their deaths." "Perhaps," Damien said gently, "you honor them best not through questions that can no longer be answered, but through the life you continue building in their memory, the genuine good you're bringing to this pack, precisely because of the values they clearly instilled in you, even in the brief years you had together." She considered this for a long moment, watching sunlight dance across the memorial's carved names, and found, gradually, a measure of peace settling more fully into her heart than she had believed possible during those darkest weeks of danger and uncertainty months earlier. Whatever grief remained for the parents she'd lost too young to properly remember, she carried forward now not simply their memory, but their evident courage and compassion, woven directly into the life and purpose she had built for herself against every improbable odd. As the seasons continued turning, and the pack settled fully into the hard-won peace their sacrifices had secured, Elira found herself increasingly confident in her role, increasingly beloved by both the household staff who had once worked alongside her, and the warriors and elders who had initially questioned her worthiness to stand beside their alpha king. The transformation from anonymous servant girl to respected, genuinely capable Luna had not happened overnight, had required considerable courage and sacrifice, and hard-won growth throughout. But standing now, months removed from the desperate danger that had once defined her days, Elira understood fully that every difficult step of that journey had led her, ultimately, exactly where she was always meant to be. One evening, as winter's first frost settled over the estate grounds, Damien found her once again near the memorial beneath the ancient oak, and this time, his expression carried a particular, careful anticipation that immediately caught her attention. "I have something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his voice carrying a nervous energy she rarely witnessed from him anymore, given how thoroughly their bond had settled into comfortable, unshaken certainty over the preceding months. "You already made me your Luna," Elira said, a teasing smile touching her lips, despite the sudden flutter of anticipation in her own chest. "What could possibly require this much nervous energy, after everything we've already survived together?" Damien knelt before her then, beside the memorial that honored everything they had sacrificed and overcome to reach this moment, and Elira felt her breath catch entirely as she understood, with sudden, overwhelming clarity, exactly what he intended to ask. "Elira Vance," Damien said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "From the moment my wolf sensed you were in danger that first terrifying night, I have known, with a certainty I struggled for weeks to fully accept, that you were meant to stand beside me, not simply as Luna in title, but as my partner in every genuine sense that matters. You have faced danger with courage I've rarely witnessed, even among my most experienced warriors. You have brought compassion and wisdom to this pack that I could never have provided alone, and you have taught me, through everything we've endured together, exactly what it means to choose someone fully, without reservation, regardless of the cost that choice demands." He reached into his coat and withdrew a simple, elegant ring, clearly crafted with careful attention. The band worked with a design that echoed, subtly, the pattern of oak leaves surrounding them. "Will you marry me?" he asked, not as Alpha and Luna bound by pack tradition alone, but as two people who chose each other, fully and freely, through every trial that tried to keep us apart. Tears spilled freely down Elira's cheeks as she nodded, unable to trust her voice for a long moment, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion swelling within her chest. "Yes," she finally managed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, of course, Damien. 1,000 times yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, the ring slipping onto her finger as he kissed her deeply, both of them overcome with joy amid the quiet, sacred space they had built together, to honor everything sacrificed along the difficult road that had led them here. Somewhere nearby, autumn leaves drifted gently down from the ancient oak, settling softly around the memorial stones that bore silent witness to this moment of pure, hard-won happiness. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the estate, and the household, still riding the warm afterglow of Elira's formal recognition as Luna months earlier, embraced the news with genuine, unrestrained joy. Ren nearly tackled Elira with an enthusiastic embrace the moment she heard, insisting immediately on helping with wedding preparations, despite Elira's laughing protests that planning had barely even begun. Elder Corwin, when informed of the engagement, offered his congratulations with a warmth that would have seemed entirely unthinkable during those early, suspicious weeks following Elira's first fateful encounter with the Alpha King. "This pack has been fortunate indeed," he said, "to witness a bond this genuine take root and flourish, despite every obstacle placed before it. I look forward to celebrating your union properly, my lady, whenever preparations allow." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of joyful preparation, wedding plans unfolding alongside Elira's continuing duties as Luna, allied leaders sending word of their eager anticipation to attend a celebration that promised, after everything the pack had endured, to represent genuine, unshadowed joy, rather than the tense, danger-laced ceremonies that had marked her earlier journey toward this position. Alpha Rowena sent a particularly warm message, expressing genuine delight at witnessing the continuation of a story she had watched unfold, with considerable personal investment, since that fateful confrontation in the Neutral Valley months earlier. Damien, despite his considerable duties as Alpha King, insisted on personally involving himself in wedding preparations far more than tradition typically required, a fact that amused Elira considerably, given his usual reliance on advisors and elders for matters of ceremony and tradition. "You didn't strike me as someone particularly invested in flower arrangements," she teased one evening, finding him reviewing garden layouts with unexpected intensity. "I've spent considerable time in recent months, learning exactly how much joy and meaning exists in details I once dismissed as unimportant," he said, a warm smile touching his features. This wedding will not be simply another formal obligation fulfilled for the sake of tradition, Alira. It will be a genuine celebration of everything we fought to build together, and I intend to ensure every detail reflects that properly. She found herself increasingly moved, throughout those busy preparatory weeks, by how thoroughly Damien had grown and changed since that first terrifying night in the courtyard. From a composed, dutiful king struggling against feelings he initially tried desperately to suppress, into a man who embraced fully, and without reservation, the genuine love and partnership their extraordinary journey together had ultimately secured. As winter deepened around the estate, preparations for their wedding continued steadily, the household finding, in this joyful anticipation, a fitting conclusion to months of danger and sacrifice that had ultimately given way to hard-won, genuine peace. Alira spent quiet evenings with Ren and other household staff, laughing over wedding details and reminiscing, with growing warmth rather than lingering pain, about the improbable journey that had carried her from anonymous kitchen servant to Luna preparing to marry the Alpha King whose wolf had recognized her, against every expectation and tradition, from the very first fateful night danger brought them together. She thought often, during those quiet preparatory weeks, of her parents, of the courage and sacrifice that had ultimately, after 15 years and considerable danger, led her to exactly the life and love she now prepared to fully embrace. Whatever grief remained for the family she'd lost too young to properly remember, she carried forward now with genuine gratitude rather than simple sorrow, understanding fully that their sacrifice, however painful its cost, had ultimately given her the chance to build a life and a love more extraordinary than she ever could have imagined during those anonymous, uncertain years spent quietly working within the estate's kitchens. The final weeks before the wedding brought one last, small piece of closure that Alira had not anticipated, but welcomed with genuine gratitude. Callum, having spent months continuing his careful investigation into the full scope of Thornwood's crimes, arrived one afternoon with additional documents recovered from Dusk Hollow's own archives during the Provisional Council's thorough review of the former Alpha's private records. "We found correspondence confirming your parents' final months more thoroughly than the fragments we'd previously pieced together," Callum said gently, presenting Alira with a small bundle of aged letters. "It seems your father maintained secret contact with a handful of loyal allies within Dusk Hollow, even after fleeing to Ashgrove, carefully coordinating what evidence to preserve, and how best to eventually expose Thornwood's crimes, should the opportunity ever arise safely." Alira accepted the letters with trembling hands, reading through her father's careful, determined words, describing his ongoing efforts to ensure justice would eventually be served, even if circumstances prevented him from witnessing it personally. One particular passage, written mere weeks before her parents' deaths, struck her with particular, bittersweet force. "Whatever becomes of us," her father had written, "I take comfort knowing that Alira will grow up within Ashgrove's protection, safe from the danger that follows us, and that someday, should fate allow, the truth we've sacrificed so much to preserve will finally see the light it deserves." "He knew," Alira said softly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she read the words. "He knew he might not survive to see it finished, but he trusted that someday, somehow, the truth would matter." "And it did," Damien said gently, having joined her partway through Callum's visit, his hand finding hers with familiar, steady comfort. "Everything he sacrificed, everything he hoped for, it all came true, Alira, exactly as he trusted it eventually would." She held the letters close, grief and gratitude tangled together in equal, powerful measure, understanding fully now, with this final piece of her parents' story finally illuminated, that their sacrifice had never been in vain, that the anonymous, uncertain childhood she'd once believed herself destined for had instead led her, through considerable danger and hard-won courage, toward exactly the extraordinary life and love her father had quietly hoped she might someday find. That evening, she added the newly discovered letters to a small, careful collection she kept near the memorial beneath the ancient oak, a growing testament to the parents she had never truly known, but whose courage and sacrifice had shaped every meaningful turn of her extraordinary journey. As winter's first true snow began falling gently over the estate grounds, Alira stood quietly beside the memorial, Damien's arm warm around her shoulders, both of them looking toward a wedding, and a future that represented everything they had fought so hard, together, to finally, fully earn. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, winter sunlight glittering across a fresh layer of snow blanketing the estate grounds, transforming the familiar courtyard into something that looked, to Alira's eyes, almost magical, as she prepared for the day she had once believed entirely impossible for someone in her position to ever experience. Ren fussed over her final preparations with practiced, joyful efficiency, while Alira caught glimpses of her reflection in the mirror, still occasionally startled by how completely her life had transformed since that first terrifying night in the western courtyard. "Nervous?" Ren asked, noticing the flutter of anticipation clearly visible despite Alira's outward composure. "Terrified," Alira admitted with a laugh, "though not nearly as terrified as I've been during considerably more dangerous moments these past months. This feels like a good kind of terrified." "The best kind," Ren agreed, adjusting the final details of Alira's gown, an elegant creation that honored both her position as Luna and the simpler tastes that still, fundamentally, defined who she was beneath the elevated title. "Ready?" Alira drew a steadying breath, thinking briefly of her parents, of everything that had led toward this remarkable day, and nodded with genuine, settled confidence. "Ready." The ceremony itself took place within the estate's grand hall, transformed for the occasion, with careful, elegant decoration that balanced tradition and genuine warmth in equal measure. Allied leaders filled the gathered seats alongside Ashgrove's own household, Alpha Rowena seated prominently among honored guests, her expression carrying evident pride and affection as she watched the proceedings unfold. Elder Corwin stood ready to officiate, his role in this ceremony carrying particular significance given the journey his own perspective had traveled since those early, suspicious weeks following Alira's arrival into the Alpha King's life. Damien waited at the head of the hall as Alira made her way down the aisle, and the expression on his face as their eyes met, pure, unguarded joy, mixed with the same fierce, unwavering devotion that had defined his feelings for her since that very first fateful night, brought fresh tears to her eyes, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "You look radiant," he murmured as she reached his side, taking her hands in his with familiar, steady warmth. "You look rather pleased with yourself," she replied softly, a teasing smile touching her lips despite the emotion swelling within her chest. "I have every reason to be," he said. "I am about to marry the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Elder Corwin began the formal ceremony, his voice carrying warmth and genuine respect as he guided them through vows that honored both ancient pact tradition and the genuine, hard-won love that had brought them to this moment. When the time came for personal vows, Damien spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "Alira," he said, "my wolf chose you before I fully understood why, recognizing something essential in you that took my own heart considerably longer to accept fully. Since that recognition, you have taught me courage I didn't know I lacked, compassion that has made me a better leader for this pack, and love more genuine than I ever believed possible for someone carrying the weight of a crown. I promise to stand beside you, always, through whatever challenges our future holds, exactly as you have stood beside me, through everything that tried to keep us apart." Alira, her own voice trembling slightly with emotion, offered her vows in return. "Damien, I arrived at this pack as an orphan child, believing myself destined for an anonymous, unremarkable life. You saw something in me that even I struggled to believe, and through every trial we've faced together, you never once wavered in that belief. I promise to stand beside you as Luna, as partner, as the person who chose you as fully and completely as your wolf chose me that first terrifying night, for every day of the life we now build together." Elder Corwin completed the formal blessing, and as he pronounced them fully bound in marriage, the gathered crowd erupted into joyful celebration, cheers and applause echoing across the grand hall as Damien pulled Alira into a deep, tender kiss, sealing a union that represented, fully and completely, everything they had sacrificed and fought to earn together. The celebration that followed stretched long into the winter evening, music and laughter filling the estate grounds as guests from across the region joined in genuine, unguarded joy, a stark and welcome contrast to the danger and tension that had once defined so much of Alira's journey toward this remarkable day. She danced with Damien beneath softly falling snow, surrounded by allies and friends who had witnessed and supported her extraordinary transformation, from anonymous servant girl to beloved Luna, and felt, throughout every joyful moment, a profound gratitude for the improbable, difficult path that had ultimately led her exactly where she was always meant to be. Years passed following that joyful winter wedding, the Ashgrove pack flourishing under Damien and Alira's shared leadership, their partnership growing steadily stronger as they navigated the ongoing responsibilities of ruling together. Alira's particular insight and compassion continuing to shape the pack's approach toward its own people in ways that earned genuine, lasting devotion from every corner of the household and territory alike. The memorial beneath the ancient oak remained a place of quiet reflection throughout those years, tended carefully, visited often, a permanent testament to the sacrifice and courage that had ultimately secured the peace the pack now enjoyed. In time, laughter of a different kind began echoing through the estate halls, as Damien and Alira welcomed a daughter, then a son, into a family built on foundations of genuine love, hard-won courage, and unwavering loyalty. Alira often found herself, in quiet evening moments, watching her children grow within the same halls she had once walked as an anonymous servant girl, marveling at the extraordinary, improbable journey that had carried her from carrying bread across a dark courtyard to raising her own children as Luna of a pack that had come to love and respect her fully, precisely because of the courage and compassion that had defined every difficult step of her remarkable path. Elder Corwin, in his final years advising the Ashgrove throne before passing leadership of the council to a new generation, often remarked, with evident pride and affection, that Alira's arrival had taught this pack something far more valuable than any noble alliance ever could have provided, that true strength and worthiness came not from bloodline or tradition alone, but from courage, compassion, and the willingness to fight, fiercely and without reservation, for what genuinely mattered. Damien, for his part, never once wavered in the certainty that had first stirred within his wolf that fateful night in the western courtyard, understanding fully, through every year of their partnership that followed, that his wolf's instinct had recognized something essential and irreplaceable in Alira from the very beginning, a bond forged not through careful political calculation, but through genuine, unshakable recognition of a soul perfectly matched to his own. And Alira, standing often in quiet moments beside the memorial that honored her parents' sacrifice, understood fully, with each passing year of hard-won happiness, that the frightened servant girl who had once believed herself destined for an anonymous, unremarkable life, had instead found something far more extraordinary. A love chosen not by elders or tradition, but by fate itself, and a life built through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion into something more meaningful than she ever could have imagined possible during those uncertain early days when danger first found her in a dark and quiet courtyard. The Ashgrove pack thrived for generations following their union, its strength rooted not merely in the alliance's tradition once demanded, but in the genuine partnership between an alpha king and the servant girl his wolf had chosen, a love story that would be told and retold throughout allied territories for years to come, a reminder that true worthiness is measured not by birthright, but by courage, compassion, and the unwavering strength to fight for what truly matters, no matter the cost.